Chapter 537. In Chongling, it was so dark that one could not see one's hand. Yet between these glaciers, the sun seemed to never set. Being able to capture some of the presents left behind by the cultivator of Lingshu Sword Gate did not mean that one could grasp it accurately at all times. Zhang Sun Qianxue spent a long time. When the sun that seemed to never set was about to disappear from the horizon behind the glaciers, she looked ahead and suddenly smiled. She rarely smiled. Although her smile was extremely reserved, the meaning behind her smile at this time was unusual. Ding Ning had felt several times he was about to fall asleep. Every time he felt extremely sleepy and his body was about to lose consciousness, the countless invisible silkworms in his body would become active and spit out vital qi to wake him up again. But the 9-death silkworm hiding in his body could not endlessly release energy. From Chongling to now, he had accumulated energy for many years, especially the pure spirit energy he had absorbed in the spirit rain in the ancestral lands. It had almost all been used up in his previous breakthrough. Even more importantly, most of the 9-death silkworm's power in his body was suppressing the medicinal power of the elixir of life. Because of the addition of that strange army, it would not be an easy path to get that sword. So when he saw Zhang Sun Qianxue's reserved smile, he sighed in relief and asked softly, "Almost there?" Zhang Sun Qianxue's gaze landed on the flat glaciers ahead. She nodded and her smile widened. "This elder of Lingshu Sword Gate is too secretive. I have searched for his presence for so long, but had not expected him to freeze this lake into a glacier in order to hide it." Ding Ning shook slightly and looked at the ice under his feet. "There is a lake below?" "The ice is slightly thick, but there is a lake below." Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at him and said, "It is a hot lake." The old monk at the front hesitated for a moment. He used his wooden staff to stab at the ice. He did not seem to use much strength, but when he raised his staff, a vertical hole appeared in the ice. A wisp of white-hot air gushed out like a fountain. Then the heat quickly disappeared. The hole was naturally sealed by the condensed and frozen water vapor. There was a hot lake below. There was a hot lake at the top of such a cold glacier. This meant that the earth veins here, or rather, the power contained here was very different from other parts of the glacier. The cultivator of Lingshu Sword Gate used powerful methods to seal the surface of this hot lake with thick ice. He did not want people to discover the abnormality of this place. But for Zhang Sun Qianxue, who could track the presence he left behind, this was slightly ironic. He used such methods to seal the lake. The presence he left behind on the lake was extremely thick for Zhang Sun Qianxue. Resonating with her life-bond sword, it was like an enormous fire had been lit here. The three of them continued to walk along the frozen lake. At the other end of the lake, the presence that resonated with Zhang Sun Qianxue's life-bond sword seemed to be the end of this journey. Tiny pieces of ice cracked under the soles of his feet, making creaking sounds. Although this sound was no different from walking in other places, Ding Ning still had a strange feeling when he thought that he was walking in a hot lake with a very high water temperature. This lake was vast. When the light was dim, one could not even see the middle of the lake from one end. When Ding Ning, Zhang Sun Qianxue, and the old monk's figures disappeared into the dim light at the center of the lake, many tall black figures slowly appeared at the edge of the lake. It was still the snow ho. Even though the old monk had killed more than 50 snow ho earlier, these rare and powerful snow beasts still appeared again. There were more than 200 snow ho dragging all kinds of loads, surging like a tide across the edge of the lake, surging onto the ice surface that was unfathomably thick. There were cultivators wrapped in thick black cotton robes on these snow ho's back and behind them. But what was even more spectacular and terrifying, even inconceivable, was that further behind these snow ho groups, there was an army. This army had more than 300 people, all of them on foot, silent like ghosts. To be able to travel such a long distance in such a place, and not rely on the snow ho, they most likely had Realm 6 cultivation at the very least. But there was no army in the world, and it was impossible for there to be an army with more than 300 cultivators above Realm 6. Even during the time of the Bazin Kendo ground, such an army did not exist. Since it could not exist, there was only one explanation. These soldiers on foot could not all be above Realm 6. They were not Realm 6, but they walked as though they were above Realm 6. This caused this silent army to appear more terrifying than the enormous snow-ho group ahead. True night came on the glacier. Just like how the sun gave people the feeling that it would never set, the darkness in this place often gave people the feeling that it was an eternal night that would never light up. The old monk stopped walking. Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qianxue also stopped walking. They had not reached the other side of the lake, and were still a long way from the edge of the lake. But there was an icicle in front of them. This icicle was only 2 feet tall. Even on the flat surface of the lake, it did not seem out of place. But even Ding Ning and the old monk could clearly sense that this icicle had taken a long time to grow. Originally, this place had been flat, but that sword had cut off a certain flow of energy from below, and forcibly connected this place to the formation in the Lingshu sword gate. The natural vibrations of energy caused the ice here to slowly bulge upwards, and finally form this icicle. So this was the eye of the formation. That sword was the stabilizer of this place, and was right below this icicle. Ding Ning slowly turned around, and looked at the inky black lake behind him. The ice was trembling slightly. They had found the sword, and the army had followed them. Obviously, they didn't hide at all and had already launched an attack. After the initial probing and exhaustion, this army did not make another move. Only now did they make a decisive move. This meant that this army's goal was most likely the same as theirs, to find this sword. The cold wind blowing through the air suddenly started to collapse, and the thin air started to tremble. In the pitch-black night sky, a ball of dark green flame suddenly appeared. The dark green flame fell from the sky, dragging a long tail of flame behind it. However, because the air was too thin, it quickly extinguished. Therefore, this dark green flame was like the vertical eye of a moving demon king in the sky. The green flames reflected the ice on the surface of the lake, making it glitter like emeralds. Amidst the dark green flames, there were many cold golden rays of light. This was the heavenly slaughter, a powerful seal weapon of the Chu dynasty. Its power was enough to cover hundreds of feet around the lake. On the surface of the sparkling green lake, the snow-ho that had already removed its burden turned into a huge black shadow, charging over with gusts of wild wind. Chapter 538. We need to destroy those seal weapons. Zhang Sun Qianxue frowned and looked behind the enormous black shadows. Most of the weights that the snow-ho had been dragging had been taken off, and turned into seal weapons standing on the ice. The heavenly slaughter that turned the entire lake green was just one of them. The threat of these seal weapons was far greater than the enormous black shadows surging over the ice. No need. These people only have the ability to use these seal weapons once. Ding Ning turned to look at her and shook his head. They only want to use these seal weapons once? The old monk narrowed his eyes slightly and looked up at the green flames. Even though his eyes were green, he could still clearly judge which streams would pose a true threat to him, Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qianxue. He raised the wooden staff in his hand and flicked it several times towards the sky. Pew 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 pew. Terrifying and muffled sounds of collisions sounded at the same time. The green flames that covered the sky and made it so that Grandmasters above Realm 7 could not immediately charge out of their range turned into countless sparks as he flicked them. The rising sparks and the flames from the seal weapons collided again, creating all kinds of explosions in the sky. In a flash, they formed a terrifying river in the air, gathering flames of all kinds that could easily tear a person's body to pieces. These flames flickered and gave people a feeling of disillusionment. The old monk's face seemed to be disillusioned in the flames. In this moment, his movements paused for a moment. When Li Shixing had appeared in front of him with the letter, his stagnant cultivation had loosened. With each breath, He was in a wondrous state of continuous breakthroughs. At this time, he was infinitely close to the state Wang Jingmeng had been in when he had fought his way into Chongling. Time and space in his mind seemed to have been brought back to the past Chongling. Many scenes that were hard to remember charged into his world. There were countless swords and sword essences in these scenes. The clearest were Wang Jingming's simple and seemingly unreasonable sword essences. Just as his movements paused for a moment, a dark red flying sword broke through the air. The shadow of the flames on the flying sword was reflected on his forehead. Ding Ning coughed softly. His gaze naturally fell on the crimson flying sword. The wooden staff in the old monk's hand stopped in the air and followed Ding Ning's gaze with this light cough. The crimson flying sword trembled countless times in an extremely short period of time, changing into countless possible stabbing paths. The light and shadow on the edge of the sword even twisted together, like a crimson ball of thread. Yet, the old monk's staff seemed to have predicted the flying sword's next move. It did not even change the direction of its stab, and easily hit the crimson flying sword that came first. With a pop, the vital energy on the crimson flying sword shot out. The vital energy of the master of the flying sword was forced out. This flying sword flew backwards and stabbed into the left shoulder of a rider charging on the back of a snow hoe. This rider was throwing a long spear with all his power. The flying sword pierced into the left shoulder of this rider. This rider flipped backwards and fell to the ground. His body was instantly trampled into blood by the snow hoe behind him. Meanwhile, the long spear in his hand was thrown out. It deviated from its direction, deeply piercing through a rider in front of him and the snow hoe beneath him, nailing them to the ice. A snow hoe at the back could not stop in time and crashed hard into the snow hoe that was nailed to the ice. There was a teeth-numbing sound of bones exploding. The rider above was thrown into the air like a stone. He encountered some of the flowing flames falling from the sky and his body started to burn outwards. Ding Ning did not look at these scenes. His gaze landed on an empty spot in front of the old monk. The old monk's staff naturally pierced towards that direction. A thin gray flying sword appeared in the empty space. Like a moth darting into a flame, it crashed into the old monk's staff. The thin flying sword snapped in the middle into two uneven pieces and flew out. One of the pieces landed on a rider's neck and easily cut off the rider's head. Ding Ning still did not look in that direction. His gaze constantly fell on the old monk's surroundings, and the old monk's wooden staff fell along with his gaze. The movements of the staff were smooth and natural. The old monk's entire body, including his mind and perception, became unprecedentedly smooth. He had grasped the sword essence that Wang Jingmeng had used when he had fought his way into Chongling. It was the easiest and fastest way to kill, but he still found it hard to understand. When his staff followed Ding Ning's gaze again, he turned his head and asked in a respectful tone, "How can you be so fast?" True speed is not just the extreme speed that one's body and vital energy can reach. The speed of one's movements is also in following the direction of the primal energies of the universe around us. Moving with the wind is always faster than moving against it. Ding Ning looked away. He looked at the old monk's inquisitive eyes and said, "Moving with the wind is not just following the direction of the primal energies of the universe, but also following the direction of the other. Your speed and the other's speed is true speed." The old monk understood and laughed. "So that is how it is." Ding Ning also laughed. "The methods you cultivate are different. Your body cultivation method and the sword manual of the Bazin Kendo ground, even Wang Jingmeng in the past was not as fast as you. Even if he is faster than you, he will not be as tall as you. This kind of sword intent, if one didn't reach such a cultivation level and have you guiding him like this. Otherwise, even if one knew this kind of principle, who could learn it, and who could use this kind of sword intent again?" The old monk bowed according to Chongling's etiquette before turning around. When he and Ding Ning finished their conversation and bowed, more than half of the approaching snow hoe had fallen. Ding Ning's gaze did not look around the old monk. The old monk did not need his guidance. While the old monk's staff appeared clear and did not give people the feeling of astounding speed, in reality, it was the fastest in the world. At the other side of the lake, the ghost-like army did not move. Even when all the snow ho and their riders died and turned into ice sculptures, this army waited silently. When all the seal weapons dimmed and the frozen lake fell back into darkness, a deputy behind the general at the front of the army bowed deeply to the general and said softly, "No one can stop this monk's attack. So many people will die tonight, but it is all right as long as General can live." Chapter 539. All of the snow ho went from a frenzied charge to a stillness. The ice on the surface of the lake left behind countless craters in the flames of the seal weapons. The old monk's staff fell back to the ice. Because the tip of the staff had pierced through too much flesh in a short period of time, it was still hot due to the friction with the bones. When it touched the ice, it gave off a puff of white smoke. The old monk had received the true teachings of the Bazin Kendo ground of the past. His combat power had taken a great step towards the peak of the world. He was in a state of inexplicable joy and excitement. Yet at this time, he unconsciously frowned. A figure slowly walked out of the darkness and drifting ice shards in front of him. This person's face was covered by a thick black cloth. He carried 2 long swords on his back, one with a green hilt and the other with a red hilt. Both of them shone in the darkness, and were even more eye-catching than the person himself. This person was the deputy general who had been standing next to the general at the front of the army. As this deputy general moved forward, that ghost-like army, including the general at the front and the soldiers behind him, still maintained absolute silence. Not a single person moved or made a sound. A soft clang was heard. The 2 long swords left their sheaths at the same time. The sword with the indigo hilt was red, and the sword with the red hilt was indigo. It was exceptionally eerie in the darkness. The deputy general crossed his hands and held his swords. His footsteps were silent, but they grew faster. The 2 swords quickly turned into 2 ribbons of light in the darkness. A hint of seriousness appeared on the old monk's brow. He took a step forward, raising his staff. His arm naturally extended perfectly straight, the wooden staff also instantly becoming a pure straight line, stabbing towards this deputy general's forehead. There was an explosion. The space between this deputy general's brows was easily penetrated, the power of the staff tip entering his skull. However, even though the staff tip that had just been cooled by the surface of ice left behind traces in this deputy general's eyes, the powerful pressure even making his pupils deform and sink inwards, this deputy general still didn't change his movements at all. He allowed the old monk to pierce through his glabella as he continued with his sword move. The wrinkles on the old monk's forehead deepened. He did not make any extra movement. With that soft explosion, the power coming from the tip of his staff cut off all of the deputy general's vitality. Yet, out of the corner of his eyes, he looked at the sides of his chest. 2 tears appeared on his greasy monk robes. Inside the tears was his purple-black steel-like skin. There were 2 faint white marks on his skin. The tip of the staff left the deputy general's forehead and fell down. When the tip of the staff touched the ice, the deputy general's corpse fell backwards. The old monk looked forward. The ghostly army moved, but only one person moved. A cultivator dressed like the deputy general passed the leading general, and walked along the path the deputy general had walked towards the old monk alone. The old monk's perception stretched endlessly along the ice. He didn't know anything about this army, and even more so couldn't deduce these people's military rank. However, even the slightest difference in aura was already enough to tell him many things from his perception and this deputy general he had just killed. This deputy general he had just killed was the second in command of this ghostly army. While the fight with him in that moment had been calm, and there had not been any fierce energy clashes, this deputy general had been able to cut through his robes and leave marks on his body. But this result surpassed any expert he had encountered in the Donghu Palace. Also, he was stronger today than when he had gone to the Donghu Palace. The second in command of an army was far stronger than the powerful grandmasters in the Donghu Palace. This was enough to prove the strength of this army. But even more importantly, this deputy general had been the first to come to his death. He had used his death to open the way. Using death to open the way. Follow. Ding Ning's brow furrowed deeply. He had seen many armies, but he had never seen an army like this before. The old monk's emotions did not change. For him, the meaning of life was to become Ding Ning's servant. So when he faced an army like this, other than admiring the other's strength and viciousness, killing was no different from breaking open a biscuit and drinking a cup of tea. What he had to consider was how to reduce the damage the other could do to him, and conserve as much energy as possible. Even the thin air resistance had become an important factor for him to consider at this moment. So he did not even move his finger. Only when the second person in this ghostly army came close to him did he raise his staff and stab out. The tip of the staff accurately stabbed at the other's heart. The power was between the cracks of the bones and pierced through the weakest flesh towards the other's heart. But just as the power entered, the cultivator in front of him disappeared. There was a muffled roar in the world. This cultivator's body exploded from the inside out. What this cultivator did was walk in front of the old monk. Before the old monk could kill him, he exploded all the vital energy and primal energies of the universe he had accumulated in his body. The old monk's body gave off many popping sounds. It was like stone hitting fragile window paper. His monk robes had many more holes. Inside the holes, there were many more marks on his purple-black skin. Zhang Sun Qianshue's breathing stopped. Her face gradually paled, and she felt like vomiting. Especially when she saw the many marks on the old monk's body, her energy started to tremble. But at this time, Ding Ning gripped her hand and shook his head at her. Zhang Sun Qianxue slowly inhaled. The trembling in her energy disappeared. The old monk naturally sensed her desire to help. He did not turn around but took another step forward. A third person walked out of the darkness. This person used a flying sword. When the flying sword flew out 100 feet away from the old monk, the third person was already dead. This was because this cultivator had forced out all of his vital essence in this instant, pouring it into this sword. This crimson-red sword started to burn, and fell in a straight line towards the old monk like a meteor. The old monk turned his body slightly. The power of this flying sword swept away the rags on his body, and passed over the frozen lake behind the old monk. It stabbed into the glacier behind him, and then gave off an earth-shaking explosion. The ice on the surface started to jump. A fourth cultivator walked over. This was a giant much taller than ordinary people. He dragged an enormous iron hammer in his hand. When this cultivator raised the iron hammer in his hand, the old monk's staff pierced his heart meridian. The iron hammer fell, and created a deep hole in front of the old monk. Ice and snow flew up and landed on the old monk's body. Next was the fifth, the sixth. It was a shocking frequency. After one person was killed, another person would immediately walk in front of the old monk, and then be killed. One cultivator after another walked over silently to accept their deaths. Chapter 540. The old monk's wooden staff grew heavy. The heaviness came from the exhaustion of his stamina, and the resolve of these death soldiers. The realms of these death soldiers were far from his. The sword essence, or the explosive power of the second cultivator who exploded all of his vital energy, was only able to land on the old monk because of the old monk's choice. For the old monk's body, the power that barely left a mark on his skin was no different than someone hitting him with a spoon. In order to save as much stamina as possible, the old monk controlled his consumption to the extreme. Sometimes, when he used the staff, he would rather endure the damage of a spoon to reduce the consumption of his vital energy. But even the smallest injury was still injury. More of the exhaustion came from the high concentration of his mind. The goal of every cultivator who walked over was not to survive, but to deliver their lives to the tip of his staff. Their final strike before death was not because they were worried about their own lives, but because they wanted to inflict as much damage as possible on him. If he was not focused, then these cultivators who were much weaker than him could really cause serious damage to him just by relying on their willpower. As the wooden staff grew heavy, the old monk's skin started to heat up, and his breathing grew hot. On the other side of the darkness, the ghostly army had thinned out. Yet the cultivators who came in front of the old monk to die still had calm gazes, and an incomprehensible indifference. The only difference was the general who stood at the front of the army. At this moment, his eyes were filled with confidence, and they flickered with a kind of fanatical flame, like a fire burning under the surface of ice. Blood flowed between his lips and teeth under the black mask. When the first deputy general walked up to meet his death, his snow-white teeth had already bitten through his own lips, but he didn't feel any pain at all. Pain, this kind of physical sensation, did not seem to exist to him. He had vision that no cultivator could compare to. In this thick darkness, he could even see the old monk's every movement. At this time, he was seriously watching the old monk's every attack, and the trajectory of the wooden staff in the darkness. The time was actually very short. However, as the powerful wills disappeared one after another, fresh lives died one after another, bringing with them a will so cold that no one could understand them. This caused time to become exceptionally long. The number of people behind the leading general was extremely small, only a few dozen left. But suddenly, his eyes seemed to have caught something, and his gray eyes suddenly lit up. His body had just started to move slightly when a soldier, who was about to walk out behind him, keenly sensed the change in his energy and instantly stopped. Then the leading general started to move. The old monk's staff had just come out of a cultivator's chest. The blood seeping out of this cultivator's heart was immediately frozen by the extreme cold. The front of the old monk's staff maintained a high temperature due to the rapid flow and friction of the primal energies of the universe. So the drops of heart blood were still sticky at the tip. The soldiers in front of him, or rather, cultivators and death warriors, were more appropriate to describe them. Their 200 corpses piled up together. While they could not compare to the thousands of corpses piled up in Chongling's battle back then, they had piled up into a small mountain on the ice. The general who was moving quickly passed through the ice-cold air. Just as the several drops of viscous blood on the old monk's staff were about to fall, about to congeal, this general's figure already appeared at the peak of this mountain of corpses. The old monk suddenly raised his head. The senses between experts could not be described with word. Even though this general's presence was no different from the cultivators he had killed before, he instinctively sensed great danger. He did not hesitate and took another step forward. This step was the distance of dozens of steps for ordinary people, and he reached the foot of the mountain of corpses. He took a step with his right foot. The moment his right foot landed, a powerful force caused the deep ice to explode. Before the hot air from the hot lake could come out of the ice, all the corpses, including the snow-hoe corpses that had turned into ice sculptures, were thrown into the air. Using the power of this step, a vast power surged out of the old monk's body. With a boom, his staff seemed to carry the hot lake under his feet as he stabbed towards the general who was falling through the rain of corpses. The wooden staff moved through the air so quickly that all of this seemed to stop. Yet the general's figure flashed among the flying corpses, disappeared, and then appeared in front of the old monk. A piece of ice suddenly accelerated along his two outstretched fingers. Bearing the power of him and the surrounding world, it stretched towards the old monk's forehead. The old monk's pupils suddenly contracted. His true cultivation was second only to Yuanwu, and he had received Ding Ning's teachings. Even if Yuanwu attacked with him, they could not be as fast as him. But at this time, He was certain that the ice sword formed by this piece of ice would be faster than his staff. The rapid flow of energy around the two and the dryness in his body clearly reminded him that the other general was a true Realm 7 Grandmaster, and not an ordinary Realm 7. Even more importantly, the other seemed to have seen through his sword moves, and accurately saw the state of his body. He had used up too much energy, and his attacks were slower than before. This general was not like those who were sending people to their death. He was a rare Grandmaster. This general had seen through his sword move. When all of these people were added together, it was enough to defeat him. There was an explosion. The old monk's left foot also gave off an incredible power. Pieces of the cracked ice flew out. The old monk's body retreated at a terrifying speed, and the direction of the staff in his hand changed slightly. Two sizzling sounds were heard. Below the old monk's neck, a sword wound appeared on his left shoulder. The general's left hand was in front of his forehead. The center of his left hand had been completely penetrated. Two balls of bloody mist floated in the air for a moment before being frozen into red powder and falling down. The old monk's feet stepped on the ice, and retreated a dozen steps until he was in front of Ding Ning. The general looked indifferently from the air at the old monk, Ding Ning, and Zhang Sun Qianxu. His body flew backwards like a kite, and landed in front of the few ghost soldiers. The old monk's wooden staff fell to the ground and trembled. The hot air and pieces of ice on the ground flew up like the entire hot lake was about to fly up. "Who is it?" Zhang Sun Qianxue took a deep breath and looked at Ding Ning, who had a grave expression. "Not from the Chu," Ding Ning said slowly. Previously, he had been the one to say to Zhang Sun Qianxue and the old monk that this came from the Chu army. Now, he was also the one to say it was not from the Chu. But Zhang Sun Qianxue did not find it strange. Anyone's judgment would change because of the other. "Very strong." Ding Ning looked at her and said seriously. The old monk coughed softly and spat out some blood. He wanted to pull out the wooden staff stuck in the ice, but Ding Ning looked at him and shook his head. "Do not attack again. If you attack again, you will not be able to leave the glacier and return." The old monk nodded and did not insist. This was a very objective matter. Any cultivator who wanted to live would have to consider whether their vital energy and stamina could support them until they could go back and walk out of this glacier along the path they had come. He raised his head and followed the flow of wind created by the general as he fell through the air, sensing the general's existence. The general was also injured, but the other's wounds seemed to be a calculated price. The other still had the power to fight. Just now's attack was the result that the general had sacrificed so many people in exchange. Zhang Sun Qianxue looked up. She took a step forward. She proudly stood in front of the old monk and Ding Ning. Her pride was not just because she was one of the strongest female cultivators in the world, but also because she always lived according to her own wishes, and never bowed to the will of others. This was true pride. Nobility. Chapter 541. A clear wind tunnel appeared in the wind and snow ahead. Even in the darkness, one could see it clearly. It was a passage left behind by a person flying through the air at high speed. The moment the general retreated, wounded, a cultivator behind him took his place. So when Zhang Sun Qianxue looked up, a sword tip appeared in the wind tunnel. This sword intent was very strong, as if it was carrying a starry sky as it descended. Not only was its speed extremely fast, the sword intent pointed at a myriad of twinkling stars. It was impossible to determine which star was the true Death Star. A person who could use such a sword essence was not weak in Chongling. But this cultivator encountered Zhang Sun Qianxue. In Chongling, Zhang Sun Qianxue could easily kill Fan Zhua, who had followed by Shan Shui for many years. Also, she cultivated extreme cold. If not for Ding Ning's dual cultivation, this extreme cold was enough to kill her. In this extremely cold glacier, she was like by Shan Shui in the water, a true emperor. She reached out with her right hand. Her jade-like fingers easily caught the tip of the sword stabbing at her. A layer of blue-black frost that was many times darker than the glaciers here spread along the sword with terrifying speed, and immediately reached the attacking cultivator's body. With a loud crash, the attacking cultivator was directly shattered. He shattered into blue-black pieces of ice on the ground. The thick black night seemed to be frozen for a moment. Gray ice naturally flew around Zhang Sun Qianxue. Even the old monk behind her felt the bone-chilling cold. But Zhang Sun Qianxue did not pause in her movements. She simply threw out the sword she had caught. With a clang, the cultivator who came through the wind hit Zhang Sun Qianxue's sword. This sword did not seem to have much power, and was sent flying by the cultivator. However, the cold energy from the sword blew onto this cultivator's body. This cultivator's body was still rapidly moving forward, but in the next moment, with a crash sound, he turned into a pile of shattered ice that smashed into the lake surface. There were very few people left in the ghost-like army. The remaining cultivators were not frightened by this scene, but the next cultivator who walked out inexplicably paused. Zhang Sun Qianxue was different from the old monk. Just as the third cultivator walked out, before he even got close, Zhang Sun Qianxue reached out and clenched her hand. She seemed to have gripped a sword and then pulled it out. A powerful life force gushed out from the frozen lake at this time. She was using her life-bond sword. Zhang Sun Qianxue's life-bond sword appeared in her hand. But the third cultivator facing her did not see her life-bond sword at all, because his eyes were directly blinded by the oncoming cold wind, turning into shattered ice beads. Countless crystal patterns appeared in the world, like countless snowflakes connected together. This was because the cold wind and all the water vapor on this ice lake were instantly frozen by the terrifying cold energy, as if space itself was frozen and cracked into countless tiny pieces. The rapid condensation of the air caused countless small explosions in the world. The air outside the lake naturally flowed over, and formed an enormous whirlwind around the ice pot. The Nine Hell King sword appeared in the world after being silent for countless years, and released its power without holding back. Zhang Sun Qianxue swung her sword. She wasn't just aiming at the third cultivator, but at the army in front of her with all her strength. This attack was called Cold Wave. This was the true tide. For the first time, chaos appeared in the ghostly army. All kinds of light flashed, but only for a moment. Then there were the sounds of shattering and metal falling to the ground. The wind blew. The fine ice crystals formed a gray mist. In the mist, the remaining dozens of people no longer existed. Only the general still stood on the lake with one arm in front of him. He held a sword in his hand. This sword was black, small and narrow, and pressed against his arm like a shield. Nine Hell King sword. I had not expected it to be eldest Miss Gong's son. As though it was too cold, the general's movements seemed to slow. His voice sounded for the first time distant and young. Speaking meant they could converse. Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at this cultivator, who should be very young, and said coldly, "You are from Chongling?" If one has lived in Chongling for a long time, one can be considered a person of Chongling. The general slowly walked towards Zhang Sun Qianxue and said, "It is the army that Jing Xiu has been hiding." The nine-death silkworm in Ding Ning's body spat out some pure primal energies of the universe to clear his mind. He finally confirmed the identity of this army and spoke softly behind Zhang Sun Qianxue. Zhang Sun Qianxue frowned slightly, her voice slightly cold. "God-killing army by Qi?" The general did not respond. At a time like this, no response meant silent agreement. The God-killing army was Zheng Xiu's most treasured army, hidden in the mausoleum all day. No one knew the origins of this army. They only knew that this army of the Qin dynasty once had only one goal, to kill Wang Jingmeng. This was the army that Zheng Xiu had secretly trained and hidden. Even back then, no one on the Bazin Kendo ground knew of the existence of this army. Before this army matured, a great change occurred. Wang Jingmeng had died in battle. Wang Jingmeng had died, But this powerful god-killing army had survived. An army trained with the goal of killing Wang Jingmeng did not mean they could truly kill Wang Jingmeng. But just now, the hundreds of people were enough to show their power. If an army like this returned to the former Chongling, it could at least guarantee that Wang Jingmeng would not have been able to enter the imperial palace. This was the army that Zheng Xiu treasured the most. They had not fully matured a decade ago, but now they were mature and terrifying. Now, Zheng Xiu had left this army here. Even Zhang Sun Qianxue, who was not skilled in scheming, knew what Zheng Xiu wanted to do. Her voice grew colder. Zheng Xiu also wants this sword. Zheng Xiu also lacks a powerful life-bond sword. Ding Ning slowly took a breath. He also understood why this army was able to arrive here one step ahead of them. Because of Gu Huai. Gu Huai had said to him before his death that this sword was not at the Lingshu sword gate, but this did not mean that Gu Huai did not know where this sword could be. He and Zheng Xiu most likely suspected that this sword could be in the glaciers at the edge of Donghu. So, Zheng Xiu had started a war against Wuji. Other than the heaven-replenishing divine art and the ancestral lands, there was another hidden secret. It was here, this sword. The battle against Wuji was not just to attract the attention of Wuji and Donghu, but also to attract the attention of the Chu dynasty and Min Mountain Sword sect. So this god-killing army could come here without anyone noticing. If that assassination against Enbausher had not occurred, if Enbausher's corpse had not been washed to the tundra under the glaciers, and not coincidentally discovered by the Donghu herdsmen, then this sword would have landed in Zheng Xiu's hands. Ding Ning felt a chill, but he also felt lucky. But he was also puzzled. He slightly changed his voice and said, 13 or 14 years ago, how old were you and all the members of this god-killing army? Why did you have to kill Wang Jingmeng? The resolve this army had shown could only have come from hatred, and not from Zheng Xiu. Chapter 542. Fortunate to meet the 9 Hell King sword, fortunate to meet the eldest miss of the Gongsun family. This general was the commander of the god-killing army, Bai Qi. He glanced at Ding Ning and then back at Zhang Sun Qianxue. He said, but not everyone is interested in telling the past to the enemy in a situation like this. In a sense. He looked at himself and said, Wang Jingmeng represents the Bazin Kendo ground. Now you represent the Bazin Kendo ground. There was frozen blood at the corner of his robes. While his wounds were no longer bleeding, the wounds caused by the old monk's battle were much more serious than a bleeding wound that was still bleeding from the front to the back. In such a cold place lacking in primal energies of the universe, he did not have much time to waste. Ding Ning heard Bai Qi's disdain, but he looked calmly at Bai Qi and said, the Bazin Kendo ground has never been afraid of settling accounts, but at least we have to know where the accounts come from. Bai Qi slowly raised his head and looked at the night sky. He said indifferently, only those who are still alive can settle accounts. There was no meaning in settling accounts with the dead. Ding Ning understood Bai Qi's meaning. He was the one who could settle accounts, and Ding Ning, Zhang Sun Qianxue, and this old monk would die here. But Ding Ning did not think so. He looked at Bai Qi, who was slowly looking up at the night sky. He did not speak to Bai Qi, but to Zhang Sun Qianxue in front of him. He said in a voice only he and Zhang Sun Qianxue could hear. His confidence comes from Zheng Xiu. This place is extremely cold, and belongs to your domain. But it is also very high. The primal energies of the universe are thin, but it is closer to the stars. It is easier for the star energies to fall, so this is also Zheng Xiu's domain. Zheng Xiu has already obtained the heaven-replenishing divine art, so I will not interfere with her battle. Otherwise, she will know that I am not dead. Looking at Zhang Sun Qianxue, who suddenly turned around, Ding Ning said seriously, you have no advantage over Zheng Xiu here, but you wanted to fight her many years ago. In these years in Chongling, you have been waiting for a chance to fight her fairly. So I have confidence in you. You have confidence in me, so of course I will win. Zhang Sun Qianxue let out a rare laugh. She had always been noble and cold, but at this moment, her smile was blooming with fanaticism. Many years ago, she was already unwilling to accept this. She did not think that she would lose to Jing Xiu. But Wang Jingmeng had already accepted Jing Xiu. Even if she won in the sword, there was no meaning. So proudly, she floated away and left Chongling alone. She thought that the destruction of the Gongsun family was caused by Wang Jingmeng, so her love turned into hatred. She couldn't forgive Wang Jingmeng. But when Wang Jingmeng died in battle in Chongling, she returned to Chongling. She cultivated in seclusion in Chongling. She did not think about anything else. She thought about having a chance to fight Jing Xiu, and then kill her. In the past many years, this was the only meaning in her life. Many stars suddenly lit up in the black sky. Because this place was so close to the sky, these stars appeared very large and eerie. At this moment, even the brightest stars seemed abnormally pale. Then, these stars that seemed to be within reach of one's hand began to burn. Strands of exceptionally heavy flames drifted down. A life-bond presence slowly came out of Bai Qi's body. A true life-bond sword appeared in his hand. This sword was narrow, long and transparent. There were no seal scripts on it. It was like an ordinary pure white crystal, but it carried a kind of cold murderousness. When Bai Qi held the sword across his chest, this sword seemed to turn into a mirror. Countless beams of pale white starfire fell down and landed on his sword. Every time it is like this, is it really good to use so many people? Ding Ning thought of Gu Huai and more people. He sneered and shook his head. Bai Qi calmly pushed this sword forward. In this moment, he appeared very relaxed. Because this was not a sword essence that belonged to him. What he needed to do was to be a mirror and reflect this sword essence. He believed that the mistress of the imperial palace had sensed the presence of the 9 Hell King sword. So the starfire that landed on his sword this time was cold but exceptionally hot. Pale white starfire fell on the mirror-like sword, flowing down the edges of the sword like a waterfall. It formed a thin layer, parallel to the frozen lake, and sliced towards Zhang Sun Qianxue. Zhang Sun Qianxue's smile suddenly disappeared. Just like how the thinner a person's lips were, the sharper and colder they appeared. Countless beams of starfire condensed into a layer thinner than a snowflake. It looked like an ordinary horizontal slash, but it carried a boundlessly powerful aura. She had not seen Jing Xiu for many years, but now she knew that what Ding Ning had said to her before was correct. In these years, Jing Xiu had become more terrifying than before. When she fought at full power, she surpassed her imagination. The faint blue color quickly flowed and accumulated in her right hand. The 9 Hell King sword had once been thought of as the fiercest and coldest sword in the world. At this time, its power was released in Zhang Sun Qianxue's hand. The deep color deepened, and released power that could intimidate the soul. But in the next moment, Zhang Sun Qianxue threw away many of the strongest swords of the Gongsun family, and some of the strongest sword moves she had learned in these years. She used a sword move that was not too special. The fiercest and coldest sword in her hand gently drew forward, just like an eyebrow pencil drawing a line, landing on the incoming thin layer of sparks. The name of this sword move was drawing eyebrows. This sword move was entangled with many old matters of Chongling. It was the sword move that Wang Jingmeng had used to defeat the Chen young master Ji Qingqing. This sword move was not hard to comprehend, and was very ordinary for most swordsmen in Chongling. Back then, Wang Jingmeng had used this ordinary sword move to win against Ji Qingqing. He had slashed Ji Qingqing's face, mostly to humiliate her. At this time, Zhang Sun Qianxue used this move because she really wanted to use this sword move to slash Jing Xiu's face. Did she have any shame? This was her sword essence. The sword intent that she had accumulated for many years represented her deepest obsession. So the sword essence of this sword was extremely powerful. In Ding Ning's eyes, it was undefeatable, perfect, and powerful. Gotcha! All of a sudden, a thin crystal crack that was as thin as a spider web appeared on the thin layer of sparks. Then the fine crystal cracks covered this layer of starfire and spread to Bai Qi's sword. Bai Qi's breathing suddenly stopped. His intuition told him that his sword had been struck by countless huge mountains. A beast-like howl naturally burst out from his throat. His left hand landed on the sword hilt, and blood splattered from his right hand. Only then was he able to suppress the sword and prevent it from flying out of his hand. The starfire broke. It looked like it was rolling towards the stars. It also looked like burning white ropes were burning towards the sky. In the imperial palace of Chongling, a soft pop sounded. Standing in front of the spirit spring, Zheng Xiu leaned forward slightly, and a mouthful of blood came out of her lips. The white lotus in the spirit spring was sprinkled with many drops of scarlet blood, rolling like dewdrops. Chapter 543. Her brow furrowed deeply as though she felt the sword essence land on her brow. But inexplicably, even though this was the first time she had been injured like this after leaving Jiaodong Commandery, there was no anger in her eyes. Bai Qi howled like a wild beast. His fingers trembled countless times in a breath. He forcibly controlled the power of the life-bond sword in his hand, and furiously poured more power into it. Just now, he had lost, but that was the power of the mistress of the imperial palace, and not his power. He was a powerful cultivator who had stabbed the almost invincible old monk. Zhang Sun Qianxue had defeated the mistress of the imperial palace with one blow, but the star fire was so strong that even the old monk at his peak could not have escaped unscathed. No one could win against him and Zheng Xiu working together. That was what he thought. Everyone in this army who had died before him had thought so as well. Just like the deputy general said from the start. Today, everyone here would die, but he would live. He controlled the power of the life-bond sword in his hand, and then slashed towards Zhang Sun Qianxue. This was a very thin sword essence. It was so thin it did not seem to exist, but it felt like it could cut through everything, even the world. Zhang Sun Qianxue slowly pulled back her sword. She could not stop this sword. But she knew she would not die because she was familiar with this sword. When she put away her sword, a hand reached out from behind her, grabbing this extremely vicious and extremely cold sword. It might even be the world's most powerful sword before the Great Punishment sword was born. Then, this hand did not cause any resistance from her life-bond sword at all. It even carried her life-bond power and stabbed forward. The Nine Hell King sword, which carried the darkest color in the world, buzzed and vibrated. It brought out an unusually bright sword light, illuminating this dark ice lake. Bai Qi's breathing suddenly stopped. The Nine Hell King sword was the most vicious and coldest sword in the world. Ordinary Realm 7 cultivators could not control the power of this sword. If they used it, they would be corroded by the cold energy. But what shocked him the most was not that Ding Ning was controlling this sword like he was controlling his own life-bond sword. Even more importantly, the unusually bright sword light that Ding Ning had easily destroyed his sword essence. Many mirror-like pieces flew in front of him, and then he heard an explosion between his wrists. The bones of his wrists were broken. Almost at the same time, with a loud bang, his body crashed into the frozen surface of the lake and slid backwards as if he was plowing the ground. Amid the hoarse sound of his body rubbing against the shattered ice, Bai Qi looked up. Blood seeped out of his throat and dyed his thick face cloth red. There was still no fear of death in his eyes. He knew very well that if the other's sword had wanted him dead, he would have died long ago. Ding Ning calmly put away his sword, and returned the Nine Hell King sword to Zhang Sun Qianxue's hands. He looked at Bai Qi, who was embedded in the ice but still staring at him. He slowly said, "You may be interested in telling the enemy about the past. So you are the heir to the 9 Death Silkworm. Bai Qi suddenly laughed. My sword is Wang Jingming's sword essence. You were able to easily defeat it because you understand this sword essence better than I do, so the heir to the 9-death silkworm, who made all of Chongling suspicious and fearful, is so young. Ding Ning did not respond. He looked silently at Bai Qi. Bai Qi stopped laughing. He looked disdainfully at Ding Ning and said, Is there meaning? Ding Ning looked at him and said, Not necessarily, but there may be meaning. What meaning? Bai Qi sneered. When your Bazin Kendo ground army passed through in the past, did you care about adding a few innocent corpses to your arrows? Ding Ning frowned slightly. Innocent corpses? Bai Qi looked at him and said coldly, When your Bazin Kendo ground army attacked the city, did you care about the lives of ordinary people in the city? Ding Ning seemed to understand. He looked up slightly at the corpses of the cultivators on the ice and asked, Your army became orphans because the Bazin Kendo ground army fought against the 3 dynasties? Bai Qi sneered but did not speak. Ding Ning thought for a moment and did not speak. Zhang Sun Qianxue could not help but laugh coldly. If so, then you should have killed Jing Xiu and Yuanwu. Is it the Bazin Kendo ground that has the world now? According to what you say, the Bazin Kendo ground was just used by Jing Xiu and Yuanwu. The true culprits of your family's destruction should be Jing Xiu and Yuanwu. But you put this on the Bazin Kendo ground. Do you not find this laughable? Is that so? Bai Qi's voice did not fluctuate as he said coldly, In the past, during the Battle of Chongping, the Qin army had a surprise troop that went around the Sea River to ambush the Zhao army in the outskirts of Chongping. Along the way, they encountered a caravan from Luzhong. There were some Zhao cultivators among them. To prevent the news from being leaked, the Qin army killed all 300 people in the caravan. That surprise troop was led by the Bazin Kendo ground's Wang Jingming, the strategist Lin Zhujiu. Zhang Sun Qianxue's face suddenly paled. She could not help but turn to look at Ding Ning. The expression on Ding Ning's face became strange. That caravan was completely killed? He looked at Bai Qi and asked curiously, Occasionally, there will be accidents, such as a fish that escapes the net. Bai Qi looked down with slight disdain. If you want to hear about the past, this is my past. Ding Ning looked calmly at him. So you are the fish that escaped the net? Bai Qi did not answer. He thought that he did not need to. So your army more or less has a past like this? Ding Ning laughed. Such a coincidence? Bai Qi's expression turned cold. What do you mean? Such a coincidence is such a coincidence. Ding Ning looked at Bai Qi and said slowly and seriously, I do not know about the past of other people in your army, but your past, speaking of this caravan, I know about it. You think that Wang Jingming ordered this caravan to be killed? Bai Qi looked at Ding Ning like he was an idiot. What you know is more real than what I experienced. What you experienced and saw is not a true story. Ding Ning's expression did not change. He just stated calmly, the true past is that Wang Jingming only ordered the caravan to be surrounded and stopped there. The true past is that after trapping the caravan, Wang Jingming and the people of the Bazin Kendo ground led this surprise troop to the battlefield at their fastest speed. The only one who stayed at the back and had the ability to change orders was someone who would never appear on the battlefield. It was Jing Xiu? Zhang Sun Qianxue suddenly understood and couldn't help but speak. Bai Qi's body shook inexplicably. Ding Ning did not speak and looked calmly at him. How do you know about the past? Bai Qi thought and then looked at Ding Ning. He said, You are too young, so you are not convincing. Ding Ning smiled faintly and sorrowfully. Whether it is convincing or not depends on the fact. Since you have memories, you should remember that the army hurried on their way after encountering you. The small army that surrounded you should have acted a long time after the main army left. If they wanted to kill this caravan directly, it would not have been so troublesome. When the army passed, nothing would be left of this caravan. Bai Qi sat up from the ice. His body trembled inexplicably. You know. Ding Ning looked at him and said, "If you have memories, you may remember that there may have been a conflict in the army that was left behind. Because 2 people from the Bazin Kendo ground died. The people left behind said that the 2 people from the Bazin Kendo ground encountered cultivators from Zhao. But now that I think about it, those 2 would have opposed Jing Xiu's actions. Also, there is something you may not know. Most of the reinforcements left behind came from Jiaodong Commandery, and were mostly her family generals. Too many coincidences are not coincidences." After a pause, he looked at Bai Qi and said, "First, you made a mistake. The Bazin Kendo ground does not care about the lives of ordinary people when the army passes by. The Bazin Kendo ground's army is extremely strict, and may use schemes or assassinations. Most battles will be led, and the 2 armies will face each other in the wilderness. Millions of soldiers will decide victory with one blow. Accidental injuries and deaths cannot be avoided, but to gather an army like this, to gather an army that, for various reasons, has deep hatred towards Wang Jingmeng and the Bazin Kendo ground. In these short years, it is such a coincidence. Even if there are only a few hundred of you." Ding Ning shook his head emotionally. "He has only led for a few years. How can he do something like this every few days? Even the bandits who specialize in robbing caravans do not have such frequency, and cannot do so many evil things. The people of the Bazin Kendo ground are not bandit." Bai Qi's breathing seemed to stop. The surface of the lake was silent. Zhang Sun Qianxue sneered. "Even I understand you do not?" Her voice was filled with disdain, but naturally she was not disdaining herself. She said that even she herself understood. It was only because she usually only thought about cultivation and would not waste energy to think about other problems. Now, Ding Ning did not seem to need much consideration for what he said. She added scornfully, "Framing others, pretending to be innocent, changing military orders, this is what Jing Xiu is best at? What is the true past?" Ding Ning did not look at Bai Qi. He turned and walked towards the icicle erected by the sword essence under the lake. His voice sounded in the cold air. "This exists in your own judgment. I will keep your life now. How you use it is up to you." Chapter 544. Ding Ning looked at the icicle in front of him. He did not know how deep the ice on the surface of the lake was, but after the fierce battle, the frozen surface of the lake had cracked into countless pieces. As the hot air surged out of the hot lake, some of the cracks grew larger. This ice pillar was originally formed by the sword essence. At this moment, the tiny cracks on the ice pillar were continuously emitting wisps of white mist. The thin but powerful sword essence was becoming more and more obvious. Ding Ning smiled emotionally. He sensed the strong desire of this sword to break out of its shell. This sword had been sealed for too long. Famed swords were like beauties. How could such a peerless sword be willing to be sealed forever in this lake and not let the world see its glory? This sword did not want to be trapped here forever. It had only formed the sword cleansing pool for a sec. It had been a powerful sword. How could it be interested in those ordinary swords? How could it be willing to serve those ordinary swords? The sword had been resisting all this time, which was why an icicle had formed on the surface of the ice. "How do you know so many things of the past?" At this moment, a mournful howl like that of a wild beast suddenly rang out from behind. Ding Ning did not look back. He said calmly and clearly, "The problem is not how I know, but that it is the truth. The problem is that you are still alive. With your present abilities, if you want to investigate, you will know that it is the truth. I am leaving my life to you now to give you a choice. Are you willing to believe lies and live, or live a different life?" Bai Qi howled madly from behind. No one could understand what he was howling about. However, Ding Ning could empathize with him and understand what he was feeling right now. Just like the past. "You should be glad that you still have the chance to choose again," he said in his heart. Then he reached out and touched the cracked icicle in front of him. Crack, crack, crack. It was only a faint aura that landed on the ice pillar, but it instantly caused countless terrifying cracking sounds to be emitted from the ice pillar. The old monk's dim and turbid eyes suddenly lit up. The countless ear-piercing shattering sounds pierced all the way to the bottom of the lake. Then, the sword that had been imprisoned by some unknown method at the bottom of the lake suddenly trembled. The sword's trembling and struggling caused a furious and frenzied roar to resound from the bottom of the lake. Countless streaks of light appeared on the frozen lake. The entire surface of the lake, which had a radius of countless miles, seemed to have been cut into countless irregular small pieces by the sword light. Previously, the heat at the bottom of the lake was only sizzling upwards, thin and faint. However, at this moment the white-hot air was like a fountain. It was like a wall of pleasure as it rushed up from the bottom of the lake. The water vapor in the air quickly condensed and froze, turning into countless tiny ice crystals that hit the surface of the lake, making popping sound. Ding Ning's face was still calm, but there was a strange expression on his face. He sensed the position of the sword, but at the same time, he also sensed powerful forces that locked onto the sword like giant ropes trapping a dragon. These giant ropes were the power left behind by the expert at the Lingshu sword gate. He and this sword had cultivated together for a long time, and the power of the formation he had set up. This kind of power was extremely powerful, even surpassing Realm 7. But at this time, Ding Ning only maintained his outstretched hand. The entire icicle had completely shattered. As the hot air from the bottom of the lake surged upwards like a fountain, the shattered pieces of ice flew up like flowers. A piece of ice cut through Ding Ning's palm. Ding Ning did not resist and allowed the piece of ice to cut through the skin of his palm. No blood flowed out, but there were numerous pale streams that dripped onto the ice in front of him like countless little silkworms. Many rustling sounds sounded. These little silkworms arrived at the place where the sword was bound at the bottom of the lake with unimaginable speed. Then, they gathered on one of the giant chains that bound the sword. Then, as if they were nibbling on mulberry leaves, they instantly bit through this giant chain. They only cut off one of the many strands of power, but Ding Ning only said softly, "Now it is up to you." As he spoke as though he was talking to the sword, a sword essence flowed out of his fingertip, along the path that the little silkworms had passed through, and landed on the sword. This was a very simple soaring sword form. This was the simplest sword essence of controlling a flying sword. It just needed the sword to fly into the air. However, when this simple sword intent landed on the sword came to life. All of the other giant ropes at the bottom of the lake snapped in this moment. With a loud bang, many huge blocks of ice that were as big as houses flew up from the frozen lake. It was as if there were many huge octopuses at the bottom of the lake that were whipping up in pain. This sword flew up. A powerful sword essence was released, and caused all of the legendary beasts in the distant glaciers and ice plains to feel terror. A circular abyss appeared in front of Ding Ning, and then it was like the sun. Countless bright rays of light surged out of the abyss at a speed faster than the heat. It was as if a scorching sun had risen from the abyss. This powerful sword intent moved up very slowly, as if someone was slowly pulling out a sword. However, the first thing that appeared in the bright light was not the sword hilt, but the sword tip. Zhang Sun Qianxuan narrowed her eyes. It was not because the sword light was too dazzling, but because the Nine Hell King sword in the depths of her Qi sea was also constantly vibrating, feeling an enormous pressure. A long time ago, the judgment of Wang Jingmeng and the people of the Bazin Kendo ground was not wrong. The legendary Great Punishment sword of the Lingshu sword gate was the most astounding sword in the world, and a peerless sword that could suppress the Nine Hell King sword in presence. But this sword was made in a very unique way. The blade of this sword was wider and thicker than ordinary swords, and slightly shorter than ordinary swords. The color of this sword was between an ordinary cyan and an iron-gray color, and there were no clear runes on it. There was only a natural flower-like pattern left behind from the forging and smelting of the sword. This sword was in the dazzling light, but it was extremely simple. So simple that it was like a thick iron ruler that had not been completely forged, a sword embryo that had not been completed. Ding Ning smiled emotionally. This was the sword he had waited for a long time, and could be described as his entire life. He didn't make any unnecessary movements. He just completely let go of his current thoughts and emotions, allowing the sword to sense them. All of the sounds at the bottom of the lake disappeared. The enormous ice that had been shaken up by the great power was falling down, and there were soul-shaking sounds of collisions everywhere. But the world of the four people on the surface of the lake seemed to have become completely silent. Very naturally, this sword that had broken free from the restraints at the bottom of the lake landed in Ding Ning's hand. Ding Ning gripped the hilt of this sword. The old monk's breathing stopped, and he looked in disbelief at this scene. Only a cultivator of his level could clearly sense how difficult it was to break free of the restraints of the Lingshu sword gate expert and cut off the life bond energy that expert left behind. Even he could not do it in a short time. The sword is a friend, a confidant. Ding Ning knew that he was puzzled. He slowly turned around, looked at him and said, "Only when it has life, when both sides follow their wills, can they truly receive the greatest help. The sword essence needs the sword essence and the cultivator's own will to be at the same place, and then the strongest power can be displayed." Chapter 545. This was sword theory. But many theories were easy to understand but hard to do. The old monk thought seriously and asked, "How do I do it?" Ding Ning looked at him and said, "A sincere heart?" The old monk thought for a moment and nodded. He said, "Just like how all things in the world have their true appearance, cultivators have the purest hearts." Ding Ning nodded and his gaze landed on the sword in his hand. This sword started to breathe freely. The primal energies of the world were attracted by this sword and flooded into the sword. This was a sword strong enough to rule all swords in the world and rule the world. The 9 Hell King sword in Zhang Sun Qianxue's body trembled again, like it sensed fatal danger. But at this time, Zhang Sun Qianxue's gaze did not land on this sword. Her gaze landed on the cracked frozen surface of the lake that was spewing hot air everywhere. A staggering figure was leaving, struggling to pass through the layers of white heat like he was breaking through a wall. "He is seriously wounded," Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at Bai Qi's figure and said with a frown. "A cultivator like him who can lead an army like this, since he chose to live. He will not die here." Ding Ning glanced at her and said. A faint life bond aura then wrapped around the great torture chamber in his hand from between his fingers. This lifeblood aura carried a hint of melancholy. Many years ago, if Wang Jingmeng had obtained this sword when he had risen on the Bazin Kendo ground, then even with the change in Chongling, the result would have been different. This sword had been frozen at the bottom of the lake, waiting for many years to see the light of day again. Similarly, Ding Ning had been searching for a life bond sword like this for many years. This great punishment sword seemed to sense the sadness in this life bond presence, and started to give off a presence. This aura was that of knowing and protecting each other. This rock-hard solemn presence was like the presence of a thick shield in front of an ordinary soldier facing a rain of arrows on the battlefield. The old monk lowered his head and praised in his heart once more. This was the acceptance of a natal item. In the world of cultivators, it was also known as master recognition. For ordinary cultivators, this process would probably take many years. However, it only took Ding Ning a moment. The pale white sparks were still rolling back into the sky. In the silent imperial palace of Chongling, Zheng Xiu slowly looked up and wiped away a trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. In her consciousness, the presence of the sword that countless top cultivators in Chongling wanted to obtain finally disappeared. The Bazin Kendo ground wanted the sword. Wang Jingmeng wanted that sword. Yuan Wu also wanted that sword. all of Jiaodong Commandery, and she wanted that sword. However, she now knew that the sword had been refined into a natal sword. She knew that the 9-death silkworm that had once hidden in Chongling had finally grown strong. There were many stars in the starry sky. In the world of cultivators there were countless cultivators. At every moment there were people refining their life-bond items. In the cave where the old monk had been cultivating, Li Shixing sat cross-legged on the old monk's couch. There was a crystal yellow light in front of him that constantly changed into various sword shapes. Yet, no matter what kind of sword shape it took, it seemed to be unable to bear his sword essence. In other words, he and this life-bond sword were still lacking. The glaciers on the Donghu border had never changed, but as time passed, the coldness in Chongling faded. The difference between a true wise person and a fool was only time, before and after. Winter was about to pass and spring was coming. Before winter, very few people detected that the Qin dynasty was going to attack the Chu in spring. Yet at this time, the atmosphere in Chongling grew heavier. Even the ordinary people in the streets started to sense a familiar presence from the movement of some military supplies and supplies. The familiar presence came from before Yuanwu ascended the throne, when the Qin dynasty destroyed the Han, Zhao, and Wei. 2 carriages would pass by a broken bridge. This broken bridge was in a shady corner of an alley in Chongling where the snow had not melted. One of the 2 carriages came from the Divinity Bureau, the other from the Astrology Bureau. Sitting in the carriages were Chief Inspector Chun and Bureau Chief Yi. In the view of almost everyone in Chongling, these were 2 people who were on opposite sides. Even the 2 bureaus with similar functions were supervising each other and competing against each other. There were countless ways to avoid one person. Only these 2 knew why it was so difficult for them to meet. Why have you not left? In the carriage of the Divinity Bureau, Chief Inspector Chun, dressed in a new deep red robe, still looked dispirited and lonely. He looked straight at the curtain in front of him and asked slowly. Walking out of another alley and into the carriages of the Astrology Bureau, Yi Siling frowned in displeasure. If you are just asking a question you have already asked, then there is no need to meet me here. You do not like this place, and I do not like this place. I wanted to leave many years ago, but you are here. In the dimly lit carriage, Chief Inspector Chen's eyes lit up with a different light. I hope you can leave, and then I will leave with you. Yi Siling was silent for a moment. Then she looked up at the carriage next to her and said, Some things, once explained, are like a cloth. Once removed, there is no meaning. Maybe it means the end. Chief Inspector Chun slowly looked up. He also turned to look at Yi Siling's carriage. In this short breath of time, his gaze seemed to pierce through thousands of layers of curtains, penetrating through a long time. I know. He slowly nodded and said, but this time, I am asking a different question, because 3 people from Jiaodong Commandery have come. Yi Siling stilled slightly. Jiaodong Commandery controlled the coastal areas of the Qin dynasty. It was the biggest commandery of the Qin dynasty. It was so powerful that it was more like a vassal country than the Yuezhi, and not a commandery. So it was able to raise a terrifying woman like Xing Xiu. Jiaodong Commandery had many people coming and going. But since he said in such a tone that there were 3 people, then these 3 people were naturally different from ordinary Jiaodong Commandery people. Who are they? She asked with a frown. 3 people like her who can move all of Jiaodong Commandery. The people of Jiaodong Commandery have always been mysterious, especially her family. In these years, she was the only one from her family who truly entered Chongling. So I do not know the identities of these 3 people. If I have to describe it in words, these 3 people are her family members, the elders of her family. Chief Inspector Chun looked at her through the 2 curtains and said slowly, You should know that her family is dissatisfied with many of her performances after the 9-death silkworm appeared. So since they are elders of her family, they may not act according to her wishes. Yi Siling could understand the meaning in these words. She was silent for a moment and then said, "Love is an emotion hard to describe with words. Those people in Chongling who speculate that I do not like Chongling, but must stay in Chongling, think that I love Wang Jingmeng who taught me sword skills in the past. But compared to hatred, feelings like love could take a step back. Many of the people who died in Chongling in the past were my friends. Some people who were my friends betrayed those friends. This is the main reason I want to stay in Chongling. I want to take revenge, I want to see some people die, and feel that I am useful in Chongling. This is the most important reason I want to stay in Chongling." Yi Siling suddenly laughed. She looked at Chief Inspector Chen behind the curtains and laughed. "I promise you, if this hatred disappears, and you and I are still alive, I will leave Chongling with you. I can take you to see the scenery overseas, those legendary immortal islands. The beautiful scenery is much more beautiful than this flat Chongling. So you have to promise me, you have to at least ensure you can live." After saying this, the carriage she was in moved and left. She did not need to hear the other's answer. Chief Inspector Chen did not answer. "It is very difficult," he said softly and then hung his head. However, there was a hint of joy in his words, which made him seem to be a bit young. Chapter 546. Time passed. Before spring arrived, it rained again in Chongling. Winter rain was not like spring rain, and was often annoying. Also, for most cultivators, rain and water meant gentleness. Only a few cultivators in Chongling, like Yi Siling, had a life-bond presence that suited water. The rain could obstruct the perception of cultivators, and it could conceal many of their auras. So in the world of cultivators, many major events would occur with the arrival of heavy rain. Huang Jinwei stood under the roof of a turret, watching silently as a yellow-robed cultivator walked into the imperial palace. This was someone from Jiaodong Commandery. Ever since Yuanwu ascended the throne, and Zheng Xiu officially became the mistress of the Qin dynasty, this yellow robe that was like dry mud became the unique symbol of the envoys of Jiaodong Commandery. Maybe for some privileges, or to show their unique status, these envoys of Jiaodong Commandery never concealed their identities, and had to wear yellow robes like this when they entered Chongling. In the view of many old people in Chongling, this was Jiaodong Commandery's naked humiliation to the old nobility of Chongling. Jiaodong Commandery's earliest strategic importance to the Qin dynasty was just a port that could provide abundant marine products to replenish the meat of the army. Even though Jiaodong Commandery had accumulated great wealth through fishing boats and the trade of some rare spirit medicines, in the eyes of the old nobility of Chongling, the people of Jiaodong Commandery were just country bumpkins, fishermen, and second-rate merchants. But now all of the Qin dynasty, and even the world, recognized the power and terror of Jiaodong Commandery. The terror was that most of Jiaodong Commandery's great wealth was used to set up spies. Jiaodong Commandery had all kinds of terrifying sources of information. Many secret matters could be hidden from the Divinity Bureau and the Heaven Supervising Temple, but not from Jiaodong Commandery. Other than this, the cultivators who died for Zheng Xiu and Jiaodong Commandery usually came from outside Jiaodong Commandery. Especially Zheng Xiu's family, the Zheng family that had raised a cultivator like Zheng Xiu. The outside world knew almost nothing about what kind of cultivators existed in there, because it was remote, and in the eyes of the Chongling people, ever since the Zheng family took control of Jiaodong Commandery, the fires of war had never started in Jiaodong Commandery. Even the yellow-robed cultivator Zhao Gao, who had followed Zheng Xiu to Chongling and witnessed how Zheng Xiu turned from a country girl to the mistress of the Qin dynasty, did not know what kind of people were in the Zheng family and how many there were. Even back then, to kill Wang Jingmeng and suppress the Bazin Kendo ground, Zheng Xiu had mobilized countless powers in Jiaodong Commandery, but no cultivators from the Zheng family officially appeared or acted. So in these years, the Zheng family of Jiaodong Commandery was still mysterious. Those who were traveling outside were all outer disciples of the Jing clan. There were even very few blood relatives with the surname Jing. However, the yellow-robed cultivator heading towards the imperial palace today gave Huang Jinwei a completely different feeling. First of all, this yellow-robed cultivator was rather old. This yellow-robed cultivator was at least 50 to 60 years old, and was a generation older than the yellow-robed messengers from Jiaodong Commandery. Also, he could not see how strong this yellow-robed cultivator was. This yellow-robed cultivator's presence was perfectly hidden in the rain. Even if he was not Realm 8, Huang Jinwei had a strong feeling that he would be killed if he fought against this yellow-robed cultivator. For cultivators of Huang Jinwei's level, strong intuition meant certainty. So this yellow-robed cultivator had to be a true family member of the Jing family. The yellow-robed man, who looked to be in his 50s and had a medium build, entered the imperial city. He announced his arrival according to the rules and went straight to the Empress' study. Empress Jing Xiu was waiting for him at the door. Eldest uncle. When this yellow-robed man appeared in front of her, she first nodded in greeting, and then said expressionlessly, "You should not have come." This man's appearance was very ordinary, and he did not have the presence of an important person. But when he heard Jing Xiu's words, he smiled slightly. His smile was very enchanting. When he was young, just a smile like this could easily enchant some young women. However, right now, when he faced Jing Xiu with this kind of smile, it made him inexplicably filled with a type of imposing and powerful aura. He asked with a smile, "Why should I not have come?" "You have come, you have exposed Jiaodong Commandery's foundation." Jing Xiu looked at him and said coldly, "You are showing weakness." "Showing weakness and lack of skills?" The yellow-robed man's smile grew even wider. He even looked at Jing Xiu with a bit of sympathy. The way he looked at her was the gaze of a true elder looking at a junior. "If it weren't for the fact that my family is too disappointed in you, that you might cause trouble beyond repair, why would I come?" Jing Xiu looked coolly at him. "Disappointed?" The yellow-robed man looked calmly and emotionally at her. "In recent years, you have not cared about the opinions of the family, and have even been threatening the family. But the family has been allowing you more and more, not because they fear your threat, but because Jiaodong Commandery's position in the future of the Qin dynasty is becoming more and more unstable. After the reform, the Qin dynasty does not lack food, and even meat. Jiaodong Commandery's position as the most indispensable meat supplier for the Qin dynasty is disappearing, and the army's reliance on us is growing smaller. So from a certain point of view, our foundation is disappearing, and you are the future of Jiaodong Commandery." When he said this, the yellow-robed man smiled again, but there was sincere emotion and sincerity in his smile. "Previously, the family allowed you to come, not because they feared any external factors, but because you are perfect. Honestly speaking, you are the most perfect genius of Jiaodong Commandery in the past hundreds of years. Your performance before was perfect, but these 2 years are different. You have caused more and more changes, and too many people have died around you. But this is not what the family is worried about. What the family is worried about is your spring expedition this time. You have gambled too much, and could easily have gambled all of Jiaodong Commandery." Jing Xiu's expression was still emotionless. Her white skin gave off a beautiful porcelain light. "So the family has no confidence in me?" The yellow-robed man still did not directly answer her question. He shook his head and said, "It is not a matter of confidence, but the family feels that you should understand that you and the family are one. You should understand that you and the family should walk towards the future of the Qin dynasty together, and not you walking towards the future, and the family becoming your pawn." Jing Xiu glanced at him. Before she could speak, the yellow-robed man stopped looking at her. He turned and looked at the sky above Chongling. He said softly, "I remember that Marquis Li's son is called Li Shixing. When he was young, he had a dog drowned. Do not forget, when you were young, you also had a dog drowned." Jing Xiu looked up slightly, and her perfect brow furrowed. Suddenly, she gave a rare laugh, a very cold laugh. Ever since I was young, anything that I truly loved would be taken away from me by my family. The dog that I liked would be killed. My playmates who studied and cultivated with me would be arranged to become assassins in training. They would all die by my hands. Anything that could distract me from my cultivation, anything that could cause me to worry, would be eliminated by my family. She slowly said, "Without distraction, without anything that could affect me, I have no weakness. So even Wang Jingming died by my hands. The family sent you to say these words to me, including yourself. Have you thought it through? Before killing him, you may not have a weakness, but it is different now. Your position and your ambition are your greatest weakness. Unless you are willing to be under Yuanwu." The yellow-robed man looked emotionally at her and shook his head. "Pity that I know you too well. So unless you make the family have confidence in you again, in the following period of time, I will act on behalf of the family." Jing Xiu was silent for a moment. Then she looked at the back of the yellow-robed man and asked, "Since this is the case, you should at least tell me what you are going to do next." "Kill." The yellow-robed man's answer was unusually simple, and his smile showed his white teeth. "Shen Xian, Pan Rui." He turned his head slightly, glanced at Jing Xiu and said, "There is one more person I will act against. I have not thought about it." Chapter 547. Jing Xiu did not say anything else. She turned and walked into her study. The yellow-robed man walking on the path outside the study was very satisfied. Some words were meaningless if spoken too clearly. In these years, Jing Xiu did not care much about the opinions of the Jiaodong commandery, and just like he said, she had always been threatening them. But unlike what he said, Jiaodong commandery had never been able to give a strong response to Jing Xiu's threats. Jing Xiu could leave Jiaodong commandery. After leaving Jiaodong commandery, she would still be the empress of the Qin dynasty. But Jiaodong commandery could not leave Jing Xiu. Without Jing Xiu, Jiaodong commandery would be nothing. Even if they had some mysterious and powerful cultivators, in the eyes of the Qin dynasty, they were not as important as Lingshu Sword Gate and Min Mountain Sword Sect. Especially after taking back Yangshan commandery and the Deer Mountain Conference, Jiaodong commandery looked like a shining chariot in the eyes of outsiders. But in the view of Jiaodong commandery, this chariot was at the edge of a cliff. While powerful, it was too heavy, and could not stop it from sliding into the abyss. Because they could not give it up, they could only wait. The wait was worth it, at least in the view of Jiaodong commandery. With the deaths of the people around Jing Xiu had almost no one she could use. This was the weakest she had been since she became the empress. Even though today's conversation was not pleasant, Jing Xiu could not resist fiercely, and was forced to obey. The coming spring war against Chu was too important for Jiaodong commandery. So like all the streams returning to the sea, it was time for Jiaodong commandery to interfere. The chariot that had deviated had to return to the right track, and could not be reversed. At least, this yellow-robed man thought so. But Jing Xiu did not think so. "Even you think I am perfect. Since I have no weakness, how can you win against me?" She looked at the pure white lotus in the spirit spring, and heard the footsteps of the yellow-robed man as he left. She thought coldly inside. Chongling's Silver Moon Gambling House was not the most eye-catching gambling house in Chongling, but all the gamblers in Chongling knew that this gambling house was the most extraordinary. Dozens of tables were scattered around the seemingly ordinary three-story bungalow. However, they contained a frightening amount of business. For gamblers, whether a gambling house was awe-inspiring or not depended on the amount of water on the table and whether the gambling house had enough legends. The Silver Moon Casino had both. Very few people could estimate how much cash the Silver Moon Casino had. In the Silver Moon Casino, there was no upper limit to the bets on each table. As long as one could afford to bet, as long as one dared to bet, the Silver Moon Casino would accept it. The legend was that someone had once lost an entire fleet of ships here. There was also someone who was penniless but won dozens of shops in Chongling and an alley. There were at least several tables here, and the amount of cash that passed through their hands in a day was more than the treasury of a wealthy family. The bigger the plate, the more guests there would be. In the past, the dozens of tables in this gambling house were all packed, and there was no place to stand. However, the atmosphere today was a little different. The innermost 10 or so tables seemed excessively cold and cheerless. The source of the coldness was the table in the middle. It was the simplest bamboo chip odd and even bet. This kind of odd and even bet was unique to some gambling houses in Chongling. Both the dealer and the gambler had a certain number of bamboo chip. Before each bet, both sides could put any number of bamboo chips into a special container. Then the gambler would bet odd and even, and the number of bamboo chips would be counted to determine if the gambler was right or wrong. This kind of gambling method was extremely fair. The bamboo chips and the containers were special, and even cultivators could not sense them. Yet at this table, a middle-aged man with a slightly dark complexion who looked very wealthy had won more than 20 rounds in a row. He was still sitting in front of the dealer and had no intentions of leaving. He looked like he would continue to win like this. Other than this middle-aged man, who looked like an ordinary wealthy merchant, and the dealer, there was no one else at this table. When the gambling house could not confirm the other's cheating methods, the gambling house could bear a portion of the loss and let the other take the money and leave. But the gambling house was not a charity. Everything had its own rules. If one did not know when to stop and continued to sit here and win, then there was only one possibility: deliberately coming to cause trouble. 2 old shopkeepers dressed in black robes had been watching from a corner of the room for a long time. In the end, they decided they needed to invite an academician inside. The academician who walked out was a man dressed in blue brocade robes. He had a handsome face. Theoretically, being an academician in a place like the Silver Moon gambling house, he had to be a powerful cultivator to be able to become an academician of such a gambling house. His face would naturally appear younger than his actual age. Yet this man's face appeared haggard and old. He gave people the feeling that he was in his 30s, but had the face of a man in his 40s or 50s. His skin, especially the skin on his palms, was rough like a farmer who worked in the field. However, with just a glance, this Silver Moon Casino consecrator didn't walk towards the table where gambling was still going on. Instead, he walked towards another table where small bets were going on, sitting down across from a youngster. "Do you want to continue?" He looked at the young person in luxurious robes and asked emotionlessly. The young man smiled, and the middle-aged man with a slightly dark complexion who looked very plump on the other table stopped what he was doing. "How can you tell?" The young person looked with interest at the academician and asked. "You have no interest in gambling. The winning and losing here are small in your view. So you are not a gambler." This consecrator gave that stout middle-aged man a look, and then looked at a leisure person who wasn't far from this youngster, seemingly just here to watch the show. He said, "Your cultivation isn't high, but the attention of 2 powerful cultivators is always on you, so you should be the main target." The young person smiled. His smile was filled with satisfaction. "Wu Guang, someone's judgment of you is correct. In terms of intelligence and cultivation, you are nameless but real." The academician's eyebrows rose slightly. "How do you know my name?" The young person did not answer and said matter-of-factly, "I have enough tacticians around me, many cultivators, and even assassins and death warriors. But I lack a grandmaster like you who is strong enough to ensure my safety at any time." The 2 old shopkeepers in black robes exchanged a look and felt this was absurd. One of the thin old men smiled warmly, but his voice was cold. "Little brother, Do you know that in the past, there was a leader in the streets of Chongling called Wang Taishu? He received the support of the warden's office, and controlled almost all of the gambling houses and brothels in Chongling. But our Silver Moon gambling house is still outside his jurisdiction. I know that your Silver Moon gambling house is a lone wolf in Chongling and does proper business. But it doesn't matter. The reason why the Silver Moon Casino can be so successful is mostly because you have such a strong consecrator. The young person looked domineeringly at the old shopkeeper and said, "Most importantly, it depends on Mr. Wu's intentions." The old shopkeeper looked at this ignorant junior and sneered. "Since you know that my Silver Moon gambling house has someone like Mr. Wu, do you not know why Mr. Wu is here?" The young person looked back at the old man in disdain and said, "Of course I know that his mother is seriously ill and needs expensive medicine for many years. So he is here. Do you not understand kindness?" The old shopkeeper was angry. He was unwilling to speak to this young person and wanted to chase him out. "I am young and not in a hurry. You are so old, why are you in such a hurry?" The young person looked even more disdainfully at the old shopkeeper. After a pause, he said, "Of course I understand kindness. But this Silver Moon gambling house is my property. Strictly speaking, all the expenses the Silver Moon gambling house has spent on him, and the kindness I have shown him over the years are all mine. I am asking Mr. Wu to respect his opinion and see if he wants to stay here or follow me." As soon as these words came out of his mouth, the two black-robed old shopkeepers fell into a huge shock. The young person lost his patience. He took out a black rhinoceros horn token and placed it on the table in front of him. In the eyes of outsiders, and even other people in the gambling house, this Silver Moon gambling house naturally belonged to these two old people. But these two old people knew that they were just taking care of this gambling house for someone else. This gambling house had changed hands many times, but the person who had this token was the true owner of this gambling house. But they had not expected the owner of this gambling house to be such a young person. Wu Guang had been silent as he listened to the conversation between the shopkeeper and the young person. Only now did he take a deep breath and prepare to speak. "Actually, I do not want you to refuse because the matter is urgent. Only a cultivator like you can deal with it." The young person put away his smile and looked solemnly at him. He said, "It will be dangerous for you to follow me. But if you refuse, I will not force you. You stay here and help me take care of this gambling house. You are not hypocritical. Whether it is kindness or business, you have to make things clear first." Wu Guang nodded and looked at the young person. He said, "I will go with you." The young person stood up and bowed seriously to him. Then he put away the token that represented his identity as the owner of the Silver Moon gambling house and turned to leave. The two old shopkeepers panicked slightly. "Boss, please wait." It was the old shopkeeper who had spoken earlier who spoke. He hurriedly bowed and asked, "Just now, how did you win?" For these two old shopkeepers, this was the business they cared about. They really could not understand how the people under the boss could do something to the gambling house that could not be tampered with. Even more importantly, since it could be tampered with, then maybe in the future someone could tamper with it. I like violent and direct methods the most. The gambling equipment cannot be tampered with, but the people can be bought. So in the future, if there are things you cannot understand, do not start with inanimate objects. Think from a different perspective and think from people. The young person turned slightly and glanced at the two old shopkeepers and the dealer as he spoke. The two old shopkeepers' eyes widened in disbelief. This was a problem that he could not understand no matter how long he looked at it. It turned out that the previous few dealers had all been bribed by this young man. Was it all planned beforehand? How much would it cost to bribe these dealers who had not had problems for many years? This was indeed an overly violent and direct method. This young boss was not ordinary. "Who are you?" Wu Guang followed the young person out of the gambling house. Looking at the numerous carriages and the servants on the carriages, he could not help but ask curiously. The young person smiled faintly. Xie Chongxing. Wu Guang stilled. Do not be surprised. My Xie family does not have such methods. The young person seemed to see through his thoughts and said, This has nothing to do with my family. This Silver Moon gambling house is a property given to me by a friend. Wu Guang was still unable to speak. Very powerful? The young person was Xie Chongxing. He still had an arrogant air as he smiled. In terms of making friends and spending money, I am very powerful. If I say I am second, I fear no one can say they are first. Wu Guang took a deep breath. After following Xie Chongxing into the carriage, he asked, You already have so many powerful retainers and servants. There are not many people in Chongling who can compare to you, but you still came to find me. What is the urgent matter? There was an assassination attempt, and the people involved were all important figures. Xie Chongxing looked at the rain outside the carriage, and his expression grew serious. I have a friend who cannot appear and needs my help. Chapter 548. The yellow-robed man who had an unpleasant conversation with Jing Xiu walked out of the imperial palace. He walked slowly. Other than thinking, what happened in Chongling today was fated to happen, and he did not need to interfere. Regardless of Jing Xiu's opinion, today was Jiaodong Commandery officially stepping onto the stage of Chongling. Yuan Wu and the two ministers would not refuse. From a certain point of view, Jiaodong Commandery and Yuan Wu and the two ministers had the same interest. So in his view, some people were fated to die today. Some people's life and death were determined by the choices they made. In the morning light, a young cultivator who appeared to be full of vitality walked into a courtyard of the Fang Marquis establishment. This remote and cold courtyard had originally been Fang Xiumu's place of seclusion, and now it was Fang Xiang's place of recovery. Strangely, this young cultivator's face was similar to Fang Xiang, but Fang Xiang had never seen this young cultivator before. Sitting on a rattan chair, covered in a thick blanket, Fang Xiang's gaze moved away from the fish that had sunk to the bottom of the pond due to the cold. He slowly looked up. Without his permission, no one could enter this courtyard. While his cultivation had been crippled at the Deer Mountain Conference, and his hidden wounds were hard to heal, he was a general who had killed countless people before being made a marquis and had countless loyal subordinates. To be able to walk in here so easily was not much different from attacking the depths of the great floating water prison. He narrowed his eyes slightly in the morning light. The sunlight turned half of his face golden. He did not speak, and looked silently at this young cultivator who looked similar to him. This young cultivator he had never seen before walked in front of him, and then knelt down. He said, "Father." This young cultivator had been extremely respectful since he walked into this courtyard. In all aspects, he was like a wanderer coming to see his father. But Fang Xiang knew he could not have a son like this. Chongling is a wondrous city. Anything can happen, anything can be seen. Fang Xiang smiled emotionally. Then he looked at this young cultivator who was still kneeling on the ground and asked, "Who let you come?" "I am Li Xian." The young cultivator did not look up and said, "Starting from today, I am Fang Xian. It's actually Prime Minister Li's people." Fang Xiang frowned and did not hide his disdain. "There are still people in the Fang family. Isn't he afraid that my brother will come back and kill him?" This young cultivator called Li Xian seemed to know that Fang Shen would say something like this. He still said respectfully, "This is the situation," in return for not interfering in Jiaodong Commandery's matters. Fang Xiang fell silent. After a long time, he looked at Li Xian who was still kneeling on the ground and said, "What if I don't agree and don't want to have a son like you? Then I will kill you. Then I'll announce to the outside world that your injuries are too serious to be treated, and I'll still be your illegitimate child, the successor and the person in charge of Fang Ho province. The outcome of this matter will not change, Li Xian said without hesitation. Of course, I don't want to see such a thing happen. It won't do us any good. After a pause, he raised his head, looked sincerely at Fang Xiang, and continued, if you do not agree, many people who do not agree like you will die, and many people in Fang Ho province who do not recognize my identity will also die. Since the outcome will not change, there is no meaning in this. Also, I am your son. You will live well, and Fang Ho province will continue well. Fang Xiang laughed. Do I not have to consider the thoughts of the other marquisate establishments? Li Xian answered seriously, you are recovering here, and not leading the army outside. So your news did not come quickly enough. The invasion of Chu in the spring will have enough military service, and a new marquis will be born. The 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty are cold without lips. The weak will disappear and the strong will rise. This is a natural change. For most marquisate establishments, to ensure that the marquises of the Qin dynasty have enough power, 1 or 2 more is more important than one family changing. Fang Xiang did not look at him. His gaze landed on the frozen fish at the bottom of the pond again. He said slowly, since you have thought it through, what other opinions can I have? Li Xian kowtowed again, and said without another word, Father, since ancient times, there had only been people who recognized the enemy as their father for power, but today, there was the matter of being forced to recognize a son. But Fang Xiang did not think about this ironic matter. As Li Xian stood up, he asked, what does Jiaodong Commandery want to do? Li Xian did not hesitate and said, Shen Xian will die today. Fang Xiang sighed softly. The master of the great floating water prison was not important to Chongling. But the Secretariat Director, who was in charge of criminal law and convicted officials, was a new power. From any side's point of view, when the people around Zheng Xiu died one by one, and Zheng Xiu, who had no one to use, used Shen Xian naturally became Zheng Xiu's confidant, and one of the most important pieces. Jiaodong Commandery was not willing for Zheng Xiu's wings to be too full. The 2 ministers were not willing to see such a new power. The imperial family was not willing to see criminal law that could restrain royal power. Even the Li family back then could not withstand so much dislike and unwillingness, much less Shen Xian now. Shen Xian was a realm 7 grandmaster, and had high cultivation. But this had nothing to do with cultivation. All of Chongling seemed to want Shen Xian to die. Then who could prevent him from dying? In the morning light, Shen Xian was drinking in the yard. Chongling's people usually drank tea in the morning. Only drunkards would impatiently pour a cup of wine at the start of the morning. Shen Xian was not a drunkard. He drank in the morning because he had been in the great floating water prison for a long time. His body had too much cold and damp energy, and drinking was beneficial to his energies. Also, an appropriate amount of wine could make his energies flow faster, and his mind clearer. When he was in the great floating water prison, he never drank much less after he became the Secretariat Director. The Secretariat Director's compound was very close to the imperial city, but his residence was slightly further away. After the Empress gave him enough power, he naturally had the living arrangements of a major power in Chongling. At this time, his residence was comparable to the Prime Minister's. But ever since he took control of the great floating water prison, he was disliked by the nobility of Chongling, and even more so after he became the Secretariat Director. So while he had a residence, carriages, and horses, he was intentionally or unintentionally difficult in terms of using people. The people arranged for him to use were almost all mediocre people that the bureaus did not want, or even disdained. Even so, he still didn't have enough subordinates, not even enough. At this time, his residence was cold and cheerless. Only a carriage was waiting, and a yawning official was standing next to the carriage. He lacked people to purposely flatter and make arrangements. His residence took up a large area, but after a winter it appeared slightly dispirited. There were not many fresh flowers and plants, and they were all yellow and gray. But Shun Xian, who was warming the wine and drinking by himself, did not care. For him, even the worst scenery outside was much better than the dark water prison in the great floating water prison. People who often dealt with death had extraordinary sensitivity to death. On this morning that seemed no different from the past, Shun Xian suddenly smelled the scent of death. A drop of blood appeared between the eyebrows of the official who was still yawning by the side of the carriage, as if a red mole had grown out of his forehead. Then this official's breathing stopped. He maintained his yawning posture and died. A man in yellow robes appeared in front of him. Then he pushed open the half-closed door and walked into Shun Xian's residence. This man in yellow robes had a gentle face, slightly plump but not too fat. He looked friendly and amiable. But he had come to kill Shun Xian, and casually killed an unrelated official. Any cultivator who was truly friendly would not do such a thing. Shun Xian drank all the remaining wine in the pot. When this unique yellow robe appeared in his sight, he had already stood up. He took a deep breath, his chest rising as though he wanted to suck in all the air and morning light in the courtyard. Shun Xian did not like to waste words, but his identity right now was the Secretariat Director. Therefore, after taking a deep breath, he looked at this yellow-robed man who had appeared in his line of sight and said, "I am sure that although that official is mediocre, he has definitely not committed any crimes. You also do not have any authority to execute him. Attacking and killing an official of the royal court is a capital offense." Hearing his words, the yellow-robed man smiled with interest. "So you mean you can convict me and have a reason to kill me? However, I came here to kill you, so who kills who depends on who can kill who. This is very important." Hearing his arrogant words, Shun Xian said coolly, "What is important is, as long as the laws are on my side, as long as you cannot kill me, I am still the Secretariat Director." The yellow-robed man smiled. The morning light between him and Shun Xian seemed to darken. Shun Xian shouted. His body suddenly floated to the left. A sword energy brushed past the right side of his neck and drew out a faint red line. This was an invisible sword energy that formed at a thought. Mind Chamber Sect. Shun Xian's figure was still a blur in the morning light, but his voice sounded. There was undisguised shock in his voice. This yellow-robed man was a powerful cultivator of Jiaodong Commandery, but what he used was the Mind Chamber Sect's mind-thought sword. The yellow-robed man had a teasing expression like a cat catching a mouse. He found it more interesting that Shun Xian could dodge this attack. "You have good taste." He smiled mockingly and was not in a hurry to attack. He said, "I am Jing Bainiao, the second uncle of Empress Jing Xiu. 17 years ago, I was a direct disciple of Mind Chamber Sect. Among the disciples of that generation, I was 9th according to the order of entry, but I left behind most of the cultivation records of Mind Chamber Sect." Shun Xian's figure stopped at this time. The afterimages around him disappeared, but the wind he created still flowed rapidly, causing his body to slowly appear in a layer of transparent mist. His face was much paler. He had no interest in Jing Bainiao's cultivation history, but he knew that in these decades, there were only a few cultivators in Mind Chamber Sect who could comprehend the mind-thought sword and use it perfectly. These cultivators were all geniuses like Xin, who had participated in the Min Mountain Sword trials. The strongest power of Mind Chamber Sect was the mind-thought sword. The most terrifying and difficult to defend against of the mind-thought sword was that it formed at a thought. It formed in the primal energies of the universe outside the opponent, and there was no distance between it and the opponent. For example, the sword that just now brushed past his neck was a sword that formed right next to his neck and cut into his body. Without distance, there was no time to react. Chapter 549. From a certain point of view, the heart-thought sword was the fastest flying sword method in the world. Other sects, even the flying sword methods that paid the most attention to speed, would always circle around the enemy. There would be some distance between the circles. If there was distance, there would be a flight path. If there was a path, there would be a head, tail, and start. It was easy to capture. The heart-thought sword of mind chamber sect was formed with a thought. The sword energy would gather primal energies of the universe according to the will. This sword energy was transparent and formless, and had no path to speak of. This sword was in front of him, but the next sword could come from behind. Unless Shen Xian could move at a high speed, then Jing Bainyao would not be able to form invisible sword energies around him. However, moving at an extremely high speed would not only consume a large amount of vital essence, but the body was not like a flying sword. There was a great deal of inertia when moving. If one wanted to move smoothly and without a trace so that Jing Bainyao could not accurately grasp one's position, one could only do so with a few legendary footwork techniques that had long been lost. Even more importantly, Jing Bainyao's vital energy cultivation was terrifying. Each flying sword he formed could be tangible, and was no different from a powerful flying sword. The sword energies of young cultivators like Exin of Mind Chamber sect would quickly dissipate. But when he formed his flying swords, even if they missed, they would still fly like real flying swords. So when he continuously attacked with all his power, the flying swords in front were still flying in the air, and the flying swords behind were forming. These flying swords that were constantly forming around Shen Xian, under the deliberate efforts of a cultivator of Jing Bainyao's level, could form a sword net in a short time. He could not escape, could not get close, and could not use his sword to block. His body's reaction could not keep up with the speed of the other's thought sword. So since the Yu dynasty, countless cultivation places appeared and disappeared around Chongling. Yet, even though Mind Chamber sect could not stand at the peak of a time like Min Mountain Sword sect and Lingshu Sword Gate, because of the existence of such a powerful sword manual, they always had a place in Chongling. You can't escape, so there's no need to consider who's in the right. There's no need to consider whether you're still alive or not. Jing Bainyao licked his lips with a hint of excitement. He said mockingly, "You are much more famous than me, but unfortunately, you are only a cultivator of the same realm as me." Shen Xian had spent most of his life in interrogation other than cultivation. He could get a lot of information from the other's words and expressions, just like now. This powerful Jiaodong commandery cultivator called Jing Bainyao was very proud. He had been repressed for a long time. He yearned to be recognized by the world. After all, for most cultivators, they wanted to leave their mark on the history book. But the most blatant message was that he was almost invincible in the same realm. Facing Jing Bainyao's gaze, Shen Xian knew that Jing Bainyao was so confident right now that he could win against cultivators like Jing Xiu, who were second only to Yuanwu. Shen Xian did not speak. He maintained his silence. When Jing Bainyao's last words had not disappeared into the air, he took another deep breath. His face grew paler, and even his cheeks were so gray they were almost black. But in this moment, the surface of his body was filled with the pungent smell of blood. A thick layer of viscous blood was forced out of his body by this breath, seeping out from the countless pores on his skin, covering the surface of his body. Even his face was no exception. The dry leaves and dust in the courtyard seemed to be pulled over by his breath, and fell on his body like moth. These withered leaves and dust adhered to his body, instantly forming a gray and decaying armor, making him look especially sinister and terrifying, filled with a terrifying and mournful aura. It was also at this moment that he began to flee to the back of his courtyard. At the same time, Jing Bainyao's second attack had been launched. A transparent sword light with proud and powerful killing intent fell towards his left abdomen. There was a muffled sound. It was like a piece of stone smashing into a vat of paste. When the sword light touched the layer of blood on the surface of his body, it paused slightly. It only created a few splashes of blood and gray fragments before it slowed down. Then with a soft hum, Shen Xian flicked out a sword light and shattered this thought sword. The exchange in this instant was too fast, even faster than the speed of thought. Only when the energy from the shattering of the thought sword created beautiful white marks and whirlpools in the air, and Shen Xian smashed into the courtyard behind him did Zheng Bainiao's eyes flash with shock. Shen Xian's armor made from blood, primal energies of the universe, and rotten things had a unique smell of decay. This was why his sword essence could not penetrate deeply. Such a secret technique seemed to be the legendary armor of decay. It was said that it could only be cultivated by absorbing the vitality of countless rotten bones. Wearing armor was undoubtedly a good way to block the heart-thought sword. Shen Xian's performance surprised him again. But he did not feel that this would change the final result. In his view, this was just drinking poison to quench one's thirst. With a soft sound, his feet tapped on the ground. His body created a long hole in the dust created by Shen Xian's escape. His speed was faster than Shen Xian's. But to ensure the advantage of the heart-thought sword, he deliberately maintained a distance of dozens of feet from Shen Xian. Shen Xian was not fleeing in the direction of the imperial palace, but towards the Wei River. It seemed that Shen Xian already knew. Since the people of Jiaodong Commandery had appeared here to kill him, then there was no meaning in him fleeing towards the Empress. Also, the people of Jiaodong Commandery would not let him charge into the imperial city. Shen Xian had been in the water prison before, and had fought with Bai Shanshui and the others on the Wei River. He was better than most cultivators at using water to escape. But was this the right choice? Zheng Bainiao smiled scornfully. Two sword lights appeared in the dust, and fell towards the back of Shen Xian, who was fleeing towards the Wei River. Two patches of gray dust rose from Shen Xian's back like two rotten wings. Most residences were not willing to be in the clear sight of the turrets. Shen Xian's residence was at the edge of a blind spot between two turrets. But in this alley, there was an upper-level room of an inn that could see half of Shen Xian's courtyard. "Can you deal with it?" Xie Chongqing looked at the battle through the window of this room and asked Wu Guang softly. There should be no problem in letting him escape. Wu Guang naturally knew who the two sides were, but he did not ask any extra questions, and just answered softly. However, Xie Chongqing hesitated for a moment. Wu Guang said there should be no problem in letting Shen Xian escape, but did not say he could deal with it. This meant that Wu Guang did not have absolute confidence in winning against such a heart-thought sword. The price of letting Shen Xian escape may be that Wu Guang was left behind. Trading a life for a life, even if it was the life of this Jiaodong Commandery expert, this was not the best choice for Xie Chongqing. The plan has changed. Just as he was hesitating, a steady voice rang out. This voice came from a long-haired man in a wheelchair behind Xie Chongqing. This long-haired man's legs were broken. You do not have to stop this person with the heart-thought sword. You only need to kill the pawns Jiaodong Commandery placed along the way, and the cultivators who are stopping Shen Xian's escape. The long-haired man looked at Wu Guang, who had turned around. Xie Chongqing's eyes lit up. He asked before Wu Guang, "Why?" "Because we, like this Jiaodong Commandery cultivator, have underestimated Shen Xian." The long-haired man looked at him and said, "True escape is completely different from his escape right now. If I am not wrong, he just wants to find a chance to throw off the companion of this Jiaodong Commandery cultivator. He has the ability to kill this person alone. So we only need to kill the helpers that may appear around this Jiaodong Commandery cultivator, and create a chance for him to face this person alone." Shen Xian could defeat this person alone? This was clearly a mad escape. How could it be seen that this was not a true escape for his life? Xie Chongqing was in disbelief, but he did not doubt the other's words. If that is the case, then do as Mr. says. He immediately glanced at Wu Kuang beside him, as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. Wu Guang did not question anything. Before walking out of the room, he bowed to the long-haired man and said, "Mister, your name?" The long-haired man grimaced slightly. "Some call me Sun-sick, some call me Ghost Sunday." Wu Guang's body shook. "Master Wei Shangshi Gui Gu?" The long-haired man said self-mockingly, "Exiled when Wei was still here, can I still be considered Master Wei?" Chapter 550. What do we do? A heavy voice sounded in the corner tower of Chongling, causing the copper bells hanging from the eaves to jingle. Multiple guards looked at Huang Jinwei, waiting for Huang Jinwei's answer. Shun Xian's courtyard was in one of the most difficult areas of the turrets to observe, but when Grandmasters above Realm 7 fought, Shun Xian was passing through alleys, breaking through walls and tiles as he fled towards the Wei River. The rainwater in the wind and rain was like a serpent. How could he escape the sight of the guards on the turrets? Chongling had set up these giant turrets to detect powerful cultivators attacking in Chongling at the earliest time. This would make it easier to stop and kill the enemies of the Qin dynasty. Previously, the cultivators of Baishanshui and the Zhao Sword Furnace had always been in awe of Chongling and were not willing to enter the city because of these turrets that could quickly detect their movements. If they attacked in Chongling, they had to quickly kill their way out of Chongling. Otherwise, they would not be able to leave. Every corner tower was equipped with powerful arcane artifacts. The guards were not weak cultivators. Shun Xian was an important official of the Qin dynasty. When he encountered an assassination, the turrets had the responsibility of protecting him. Also, after Mo Shoucheng died, and the city guards were given to Huang Jinwei and Shun Xian became the new leaders of Chongling. In the view of these guards loyal to Huang Jinwei, Shun Xian and Huang Jinwei were the new leaders that Zheng Xiu had raised, and the present left and right arms. If the people from Jiaodong Commandery assassinated Shun Xian now, then they may assassinate Huang Jinwei next. This was the truth of the cold without the lips. But Huang Jinwei, who was silently looking at the mist dragon in the rain, heard the question and shook his head. He said, "Do not move." Why? None of the guards could understand. It was still the leading general who spoke and asked. Huang Jinwei said, "I am different from him. If Jiaodong Commandery kills him, the Holy One will not object, but the Holy One will not allow Jiaodong Commandery to kill me." These guards thought of what had happened at the Deer Mountain Conference and understood Huang Jinwei's meaning. "Is that all?" After a moment of silence, the leading general said, "His Majesty won't need someone forever, and he won't rely on someone forever." Huang Jinwei nodded. "But even if you want to move, there will be a more appropriate time." Within the Mist Dragon, invisible swords were constantly being formed. These long swords continued to land on Shun Xian's body as he came out of the Mist Dragon. They didn't just create puffs of rotting dust behind him, they also created splashes of blood. Jing Bainyao flew through the wind and rain with his hands behind his back. He was very satisfied. In the eyes of the cultivators who saw this scene, and in his perception, Shun Xian was like a dragon head, and he was the cultivator casually standing on the dragon's back. This dragon was undoubtedly powerful, but it was unable to resist his sword essence. The more casual he was, the stronger he appeared. Even more importantly, there would be countless cultivators in Chongling who would see this battle. Strength that the world knew was far more satisfying than feeling one's own strength. In a small river in the suburbs of Chongling, there was a small boat. A Taoist in indigo robes sat in the canopy of the boat. The river water rippled gently, and the boat brushed against the reeds. He was waiting for the Mist Dragon to charge out of Chongling and pass by here. It was still far away, so he had the leisure. Suddenly, this indigo-robed Taoist's expression changed. In his perception, a presence shot out of the sky like a burning meteor. It was more than twice as fast as the mist dragon fleeing out of Chongling. For example, when a cultivator attacked with a sword, no matter what realm they were, if they were too fast, they would not be able to follow up. But this meant that it was violent and there was no room to maneuver. This indigo-robed Taoist, whose age could not be seen from his face, did not hesitate. He had no sword in his hand, but the sound of a sword being unsheathed came from inside his body. A white jade-like sword light lit up in his hand. The little boat he was sitting on immediately turned into countless pieces that flew out like butterflies. As he pointed his sword up, there was a rumble in the sky like a giant mountain sliding down. All the reeds in this part of the wild river were snapped. Driven by his sword, they shot up like thousands of arrows. These reeds had already withered in the winter. When they snapped, they were even more lifeless. Yet, as they moved through the air faster than the arrows, they rubbed against the primal energies of the universe he had attracted, creating heart-palpitating vitality and green. The primal energies of the universe that came like mountains caused these reeds to miraculously turn green. They seemed to grow rapidly in the soil, and formed a green curtain in the air. At the same time, the jade-like life-bond sword in his hand gave off countless indigo sword lights that grew towards the sky like vines. There was an explosion. The cultivator falling from the sky shattered the green curtain, and collided with the life-bond sword in his hand with a wild shock-wave. This Taoist grunted. Half of his body smashed into the water below. Yet, he managed to catch this terrifying blow, and with a swing, he sent the cultivator attacking from above flying back. There is no need to fight to the death with me. After using 2 rare secret arts to stop this person's attack, this Taoist's energies roiled. His body was numb. Yet, he forced himself to speak. He did not ask the identity of this person, and shouted, "Regardless of your relationship to Shen Xian, you should know that I am not the only cultivator here to stop him. You have come like this, and burned most of your vital energy. Even if you can kill me, can you escape? Chun-Yi, you are He Chuan-Yi, the academician of the Li Marquisate establishment guarding Chongling." Wu Guang's figure was forcefully stabilized in the flying blue fragments. His clothes had been torn apart by the powerful primal energies of the universe, and were even more tattered than the clothes of a beggar. But the sword in his hand was exceptionally dazzling and extremely golden. He frowned as he looked at this Taoist with a cold expression, and did not disguise his disdain. In the past, Marquisate Li sent his only son to the pass to curry favor with the nobles. Now, he is leaning towards Jiaodong Commandery. This is the Marquisate establishment with the least backbone of the 13 Marquisates of the Qin dynasty. The indigo-robed Taoist was the academician of the Li Marquisate establishment in Chongling, He Chuan-Yi. He was a grandmaster who had grown up with Marquisate Li in the military, and the strongest of the realm's 7 cultivators Marquisate Li had left in Chongling to guard the Marquisate establishment. Hearing the other's words, this Li Marquisate establishment academician's eyes burned with anger. He sneered. "You think the other Marquisate establishments have backbone? If they did, Chongling would not be so quiet. Why should I wait here? Watching from the side is better than being an accomplice." Wu Guang stepped onto the water, and held his sword across his chest. He looked at He Chuan-Yi and said solemnly, "Please?" In Chongling, this was an invitation to a duel. The corners of He Chuan-Yi's mouth twitched slightly. He did not hesitate and attacked with his sword. The water in his body flooded into the white jade longsword in his hand like a broken dam. But the sword essence coming off the white jade longsword was extremely gentle, and had a unique harmony. The primal energies of the universe rumbled in the sky and landed far away, but quickly charged to his side from the ground. Hundreds of green sword lights spun around him, like vines interweaving together, densely weaving together. This sword strike of his was the intent of guarding. While he was a rare Realm 7 expert today, he was just an unimportant pawn. In his view, even if he tangled with the other here, there would still be people who would stop Shinxian. The other had come here at the cost of burning most of his vital energy. He could not fight for a long time. No matter how one looked at it, it was the best choice for him to use his strongest defensive sword move to deal with it. But even more importantly, he had to be able to defend this attack. At the same time, Wu Kuang had also attacked. When the green vine-like sword lights weaved into a cocoon and protected him in the center, he saw two golden lights fly out of Wu Guang's sword like two enormous wings. They grew larger and larger in his field of vision, instantly occupying all of his senses. They blocked out the sky and filled the entire world around him. The two enormous golden wings slapped down. There was a loud boom. The water in this wild river dried up. Then he, along with the sword light that wrapped around him, was pressed down into the ground. In a breath, he went down many feet. There is such a vast sword essence. He Chun's expression changed dramatically. Just as this thought appeared in his mind, the sword light around him could not withstand the pressure and collapsed. The sword light collapsed, and then his body collapsed. Crack, 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 his body exploded like a rock and smashed into the surrounding soil. Swan sword? Jing Bainyao narrowed his eyes slightly and his expression grew grave. Like many cultivators in Chongling, he saw the two enormous sword lights that looked like golden wings. Chapter 551. For Chongling, the swan sword was just a ripple from many years ago, the light of a shooting star. It was not the name of the sword, or the name of the sword manual, just the unique mark of a grandmaster. Many grandmasters who came from far away encountered such an ending in Chongling. They only appeared in Chongling for a short moment, so the cultivators of Chongling knew very little about them. They did not even know their names, the swords they used, and the sword manuals they cultivated. The swan sword was like this. Even the most well-informed Jiaodong commandery only knew that this grandmaster came from Yangshan commandery. When he attacked, his sword light was like a swan soaring into the sky with a vast presence. In the past, the Shang clan had reformed with the support of the Bazin Kendo ground. Yangshan commandery had not been the first to implement it, but it was the first commandery to complete the reform. The reason for this was greatly related to the swan sword. Back then, when the old nobility of Yangshan commandery had been the most opposed to the reform, they had used iron and blood to suppress the land of a village, and encountered the swan sword of the village. This previously unknown grandmaster had killed 2 Realm 7s, and almost eradicated the power of the old nobility. At the time, this had caused a great shock in the Qin dynasty. Yangshan commandery became the first commandery to complete the reform, but like this grandmaster and the Shang clan, they did not have a good ending. After being defeated in the war against the Chu dynasty, Yangshan commandery was ceded to the Chu dynasty. Yangshan commandery, the first to complete the reform, had been ceded to the Chu dynasty. But after the Qin dynasty won the Deer Mountain Conference and the Yangshan commandery was taken back, no one investigated further whether or not this had any special meaning. But in the war against the Chu, Yangshan commandery was to be governed by the Chu people. The Qin people of Yangshan commandery were naturally unwilling. In the initial years, there had been many cases of suppression and resistance. That grandmaster whose sword was like a swan was recorded to have died in a battle against the suppression of the Chu people. For Chongling more than a decade later, this was an old matter that few people knew about. Many people who heard it would feel that it was a fabricated story. But now, that grandmaster of Yangshan commandery had clearly left behind an heir. That heir had appeared at this time, and his cultivation was likely no less than the grandmaster of Yangshan commandery. But was it useful? Just like the grandmaster of Yangshan commandery back then, when Yangshan commandery was ceded to the Chu dynasty, He was destined to die. This was a true power struggle. A grandmaster like this was just a fleeting wave in the tide. Jing Baijiao didn't think this would change anything. Therefore, his expression only turned serious for a moment because of the strength displayed by the two sword lights. After he understood the origin of the two sword lights, he could only shake his head in sympathy. Shun Xian was passing through the courtyard of an ordinary family. There were several orange trees planted in the courtyard of this ordinary family. The oranges on the trees were not all picked. Although they looked a little shriveled after a winter, they still had a pleasant color. Shun Xian quickly passed through these orange trees. The bright orange color seemed to dye his ashen face and added to his joy. His thoughts were completely different from Jing Baijiao's. Only he knew that after becoming the Secretariat Director, he had gone to see Yi Siling. Yi Siling was the bureau chief of the Astrology Bureau. Strictly speaking, he was not one of the leaders of Chongling. But he knew that Yi Siling did not just represent the Astrology Bureau, but the Bazin Kendo Ground. Yi Siling was like the person in charge of the Bazin Kendo Ground in Chongling. Even if she could not act, she would have other ways to change his situation of certain death. Now, the sword light of the swan sword was the beginning in his view, a good sign. This was not a battle between him, a fledgling leader, and Jiaodong Commandery, but a game between all the new leaders of Chongling, the Bazin Kendo Ground, and Jiaodong Commandery. On the turret, Huang Jinwei naturally did not know of the connection between him and Yi Siling. But at this time, he had the same thoughts as Shun Xian about this battle. The higher one stood, the further one could see. He had taken over Mo Shouqing's position, and was the eyes of Chongling. He was the person who saw the clearest in Chongling. In his perception, other than the two blinding sword lights, there were many powerful primal energies of the universe flowing in other places of Chongling. There was more than one battle between experts. The change had started. Also, the person who had the ability to mobilize so many powerful cultivators and completely affect this battle, was fated to be a leader. So, silently, other than him and Shun Xian, Chongling had another new leader. And this new leader likely had more power than him and Shun Xian. Jing Baijiao frowned slightly. The oncoming mist condensed on the tip of his eyebrows like sparkling dewdrop. The moment they formed, they were blown away by the wind and flew out from the side of his head. They were near the wilderness. They were very close to the patch of reeds where He Chuani had been waiting, and not far from the Wei River. He Chuani had not appeared. This meant that even the strongest cultivator of the Li Marquisate establishment left in Chongling had been defeated by the swan sword. Other than He Chuani, the cultivators who should have taken He Chuani's place had not appeared. Who dares to interfere? His expression grew colder. The oncoming mist was unable to get close to his body, and was pushed away by the vibrating energy on his body. An irregular and transparent ball of energy formed around him. The surface of the ball of energy kept on piercing out irregular long thorns. The tips of the thorns shone like starlight. They seemed to resonate with the ball of energy around him. Many stars lit up high in the sky. Shun Xian glanced up. He did not linger. In just a few dozen breaths, thick water vapor brushed against his face. They had reached the Wei River. The thick water vapor came from the rain hitting the surface of the turbulent river, splashing up even more water vapor. Unlike the clean rain falling from the sky, the water vapor from the Wei River carried a fishy smell, a smell he was more familiar with. Yi Siling had returned from the Wei River in the storm, and he had escaped from Chongling in the rain at the end of winter, and stepped into the cold river water. He stepped on the waves and walked to the center of the Wei River. The surroundings were vast. The mist and rain prevented him from seeing the banks of the Wei River. Then he stopped, turned around, and faced Jing Baijiao, who was still chasing him. So the cultivation methods of Jiaodong Commandery are connected to the star energy. He looked at Jing Bainyao and said with a strange expression, "It seems that it was not a coincidence that she approached the Bazin Kendo ground from the start." Jing Bainyao found it hard to understand Xin Xian's expression right now. He said coolly, "There is no coincidence or certainty in the world, only one's own choice." After saying this, Jing Bainyao had a disdainful expression. He turned his head slightly in the direction of the imperial city and said, "You are sitting in the position of Secretariat Director because of her favor. But from the meaning of your words just now, you are not so loyal to her. It's ironic that the confidant she's nurtured is only so." Xin Xian shook his head and sneered at him. He said, "What you say is not correct. I am sitting in this position not because of her favor, but because of an exchange. Just because of her needs." After a pause, Xin Xian looked in the direction of the imperial city and said, "If you are really her confidant, she would not have you appear in front of me to kill me today. Just like the people she was close to in the Bazin Kendo ground, I am just satisfying her needs for a moment. Since you know this, why struggle in pain?" Jing Bainyao's clear emotions disappeared as he looked calmly at Xin Xian. Xin Xian's rotting armor slowly disappeared in the wash of the rain. What disappeared first were the dried leaves, branches and dust stuck to the blood, and then the layer of sticky blood. Because of the great loss of blood, Xin Xian's body appeared cold and unusually pale, like a corpse that had been soaked in the Wei River for a long time. The Bazin Kendo ground is the same to her, and so am I. Jiaodong Commandery is the same to her. That was then, this is now. Xin Xian looked at Jing Bainyao and said slowly, "The ones in control of Chongling are Yuanwu and her. If you want to survive in Chongling, either prove to be useful to Yuanwu or prove to be useful to her. Maybe the present Jiaodong Commandery is just a shackle to her?" Some fresh sword essence appeared on Xin Xian's body. Just as this sword essence was released, the Wei River under his feet started to boil like hot porridge. Jing Bainyao's eyes flashed. He inexplicably smelled a hint of danger. Xin Xian, who did not like to talk, said these words as though his only goal was to have the rotting armor on his body retreat. After it all retreated, his body could release energy better, and summon the abundant water essence on the surface of the water. But what he could not understand was, without the protection of the rotting armor, how could Xin Xian stop his heart-thought sword? "You think you are invincible in the same realm, but you do not understand. The reason I struggle in pain is because I am confident I can defeat you alone. You think you can shine like her once you appear, and continue to shine like this in Chongling. But like many experts who have come to Chongling, you are just a passerby. You're just a fallen leaf in this storm." Xin Xian's voice continued to sound. When the words leaf sounded, his sword essence was completely released, and his body was drowned in the wind and rain. The moment Xin Xian released his sword essence, the blood faded from Jing Bainyao's face, and he became as pale as Xin Xian. "What sword essence is this?" He was naturally faster than Xin Xian, but as his thoughts moved, his mental power and the vital energy he released, and the primal energies of the universe he summoned were all twisted and messed up by the wind and rain. The vital energy and primal energies of the universe that supported his thoughts, as they flowed towards Xin Xian, were blown around like a flying sword in the wind and rain. They slowed down as they moved around. It was like a flying sword that could appear directly next to the enemy, but now had to pass through the wind and rain, and float to the enemy's side like a leaf. All the advantages of the heart-thought sword no longer existed. In terms of using the sword, the heart-thought sword of Mind Chamber sect was defeated by Xin Xian's peerless wind and rain sword essence. Chapter 552. He had thought that the heart-thought sword could be defeated like this, but the reason the power was so destructive was because it was gathered at one point and condensed to the extreme. No matter how much primal energies of the universe flowed through the world, if they could not gather, they would be no different from a breeze. In this world, there were countless people fishing in the water and walking in the wind, but they would not be cut by the water flow or blown to pieces by the wind. The larger the area the sword essence covered, the more scattered the power would be. Usually, it could only be used to deal with ordinary armies and swordsmen. There was no sword manual in Chongling that could be like the sword essence Xin Xian was using right now. The wind and rain was peerlessly sharp, and the area it covered was so wide it could cut through the primal energies of the universe and the stars coming down from the sky. This was definitely not a Chongling sword manual. Where did Xin Xian get a sword manual like this? In this moment, the pale Jing Bainiao finally understood that Xin Xian had the confidence to kill him. The reason he had paid such a price to escape to the Wei River was not to use the water to escape, but to use the mist and wind of the Wei River to hide his attack. A hint of fear appeared in the depths of Jing Bainiao's eyes. With a sharp howl, his vital energy surged out without holding back. The thought sword swaying in the peerless wind and rain formed even faster. At the same time, his entire body flew upwards like a meteor, shooting upwards at an astonishing speed. If he could charge out of the area covered by the wind and rain, his heart-thought sword could recover its original power. In the sky, Xin Xian's attack could not be hidden from the other cultivators. In his field of vision, the sky rapidly lit up. In just a breath, he would charge out of the border of this peerless wind and rain. However, at this moment, two beams of light appeared below him. These two lights were filled with decisiveness and violence. They were not sword lights, but Xin Xian's gaze. With a hiss, a thin sword formed from water and formed under Jing Bainiao's feet as though Xin Xian's gaze had landed on his feet. Two red lines appeared on Jing Bainiao's feet. Both of his feet were instantly severed by the sword. One sky water. An extremely shrill and miserable howl burst out from between his lips and teeth with extreme shock and disbelief. This was the ultimate skill of Yi Xiling's sect. But due to the past, Yi Xiling was undoubtedly the most powerful person in Chongling who was closest to the Bazin Kendo ground. Even if she was loyal to Yuanwu, she could not be close to the master of the great floating water prison, Xin Xian. However, the incomparably real pain reminded him that this was an absolute fact. Amidst the mournful howls, he swung both of his hands downwards. In this cramped space, the vast vital energy from his palms gave up on the sword principles of the heart-thought sword and merged with the primal energies of the universe to form two crystal swords like icicles that stabbed towards Xin Xian's eyes. The sharp sword essence pierced Xin Xian's eyes. But Jing Bainiao, who had discovered Xin Xian's secret, did not even think about the possibility of killing Xin Xian alone. He just wanted to escape the Wei River. Due to the great loss of blood, Xin Xian's face was still extremely pale. But at this time, his cold eyes once again shone with determination. He advanced instead of retreating, his body twisting slightly upwards. His right sleeve swung up, and with a wave of wind and rain, he shattered Jing Bainiao's sword. Then, with an ear-piercing tearing sound, he used his body to collide with Jing Bainiao's other sword. Jing Bainiao's pupils contracted. There was an explosion. His sword had not been able to pierce Xin Xian's body, but shattered into countless pieces in the violent collision. A cold light with a unique metallic reflection filled his perception world at this moment with a true sense of death. Xin Xian's right arm had been cut off in the battle of the great floating water prison. Yet no one had thought that he had hidden a piece of black iron in his empty sleeve. This piece of black iron was like his right arm at this moment. He used his right arm to block Jing Bainiao's attack. The violent tremors caused Xin Xian's eyes to become bloodshot and his pupils bulged slightly. But his movements were still cold and steady. There was a splash of water between his fingers. He pulled it into a thread, and then a sword that stabbed into Jing Bainiao's energy sea. With a pop, it exploded inside Jing Bainyao body. It was like the sound of a sheepskin raft blowing past its limit. It was the first time Jing Bainyao heard such a sound. So when a person's energy sea was pierced and exploded, it was like this. At this moment, such a thought flashed through his mind subconsciously in extreme fear. In the next instant, his entire body exploded outwards like a sheepskin raft. His flesh and blood were turned to mist by the rampaging vital energy and primal energies of the universe. The feeling at this moment was not bloody, only energy flowing outwards. Shen Xian coughed violently. His body arched, and he fell down like a convulsing shrimp in pain. With a splash, he fell into the Wei River below. In the sky hard to see, the stars that had just lit up quickly disappeared. In Chongling, 3 people sensed the result of this battle first. Empress Jing Xiu slowly raised her head. Her gaze passed through the light from the well to the spirit spring in front of her. She seemed to see the stars disappear, and then a smile appeared at the corners of her mouth. Chongling had many stern people, and their smiles were rarely seen. But her smile was even rarer. Not many people in the world had seen her smile before. Especially at this moment, the smile on his perfect face that was full of coldness was like an extremely beautiful flower that bloomed in blood, soul-stirring and full of bewitchment. The 2 yellow-robed cultivators who had left Jiaodong Commandery with Jing Bainyao looked up at the same time. One of them had just had an unpleasant conversation with Jing Xiu. He had just boarded a carriage. Sensing Jing Bainyao's death, he sank into great shock. The other yellow-robed cultivator was not in Chongling right now. He wore a bamboo hat, and stood at the bow of a small boat going down the river. There was another boat in front of his boat. His presence was locked onto the other arm of the Empress, one of Jing Xiu's most trusted subordinates, the palace master of Endless Palace, Pan Rui. He had followed Pan Rui for many days. The reason he was not in a hurry to act was because he wanted to wear down Pan Rui's spirit like an eagle, so it would be easier to kill her. In the view of him, Jing Bainyao and the yellow-robed cultivator in Chongling, Shen Xian and Pan Rui were just prey, and they were hunters with sharp weapons. But now, Jing Bainyao, the hunter, had died. Jing Bainyao's death caused his confidence to waver slightly. He suddenly had an ominous feeling. Chapter 553. At this time, the small boat ahead that had been flowing down the river stopped. The prow of the boat came to rest in the weeds of the shallow water. In the drizzle, Pan Rui, who had been quietly staying in the cabin of the boat, walked out to the back of the boat and waited for the arrival of his boat. The surface of the river had a hazy and dreamy color, causing Pan Rui, in her light yellow robes, to look like a legendary water goddess. The yellow-robed cultivator standing at the bow of the small boat drifting down from upstream had a tall and straight figure. The man and woman on the 2 small boats that were gradually getting closer, if they were painted by an artist, they would definitely look like a pair of lovers who had just reunited after being separated for a long time. But the 2 people on the boat who were so calm knew that after meeting today, only one of them could leave here alive. Actually, I do not like to kill people. I always feel that I have to carry some of my own emotions when killing people. If it is not hatred, it is that the other makes me unhappy, or the other is disgusting and makes me feel disgust at first sight. The yellow-robed cultivator's boat slowly stopped at the center of the water. His furrowed brows slowly relaxed. He looked at Pan Rui, and said slowly without any opening remarks like he was familiar with her, "When I first started cultivating as a child, I found it hard to understand no matter if it was stories or record. Both sides who had to fight to the death seemed to like speaking nonsense. But when I grew older and started to kill people, I started to understand because killing is not a pleasant thing. The true meaning of conversation is to ease this unpleasant feeling, especially when facing an opponent you have never encountered before, a complete stranger. If you kill them upon encountering them and then face a cold corpse, it really feels like you are chewing wax, empty, lonely, and cold. So, what do you say? After saying this, the yellow-robed cultivator bowed to Pan Rui and added, "This one is Jing Jingqing. I know who you are." Pan Rui looked at this yellow-robed cultivator like she was looking at someone familiar and said, "The best assassin of Jiaodong Commandery, one of the 4 cultivators of Jiaodong Commandery that Jing Xiu fears the most. When the Qin dynasty's fleets opened the sea route, many powerful cultivators on the islands died to your assassinations. In terms of military merit, at least, your military merit does not belong to Liang Lian. You are the most cautious in your actions, and do not overlook any possibility of hindering your attack. You have been following me all this time, and now you are saying this to me because you do not want any shadow to affect your attack. You are very honest." Zheng Jingqing pressed his lips together and said, "Because you understand the Empress and Jiaodong Commandery too well, you are second on the list of those who must die. But I do not understand. You know my intentions. In the days that I followed you, why did you not find a chance to attack? With your cultivation, it's impossible for you not to find an opportunity to gain the upper hand." Pan Rui did not reply for a long time. When she spoke again, her expression was slightly cold. "Because I am thinking." Jing Jingqing asked naturally, "What are you thinking about?" "I am thinking, if I and Jing Xiu's positions were switched, and encountered such a situation, if I was Jing Xiu, what would I do?" Pan Rui said coldly, "I understand. If I have a clear conscience, regardless of whether the other believes me or not, I will try to explain." But I did not wait for the person she sent to explain, but the person who came to kill me. So I did not attack first. You can say I was waiting to see if she would do something to stop you from killing me. Pan Rui sneered. She looked at where Xin Xian and Jing Bainyao had fought. She paused and then said, "The result is that the killing has started, but I did not get any explanation from her. This means that some of my guesses are correct. She knows the truth cannot be concealed, so she can only use you to get rid of me." Jing Jingqing listened seriously to her words. His expression did not change, and even had a hint of sympathy. "Your guesses should be correct. You want to talk to me more because your emotions are fluctuating. Clearly, your assassination against someone in Chongling has failed. But even if you say so much to me now, and confirm that I have no path to take, I fear that talking to me will not help you in your attack, and will affect your emotions and confidence." Pan Rui looked at this most cautious Jiaodong Commandery cultivator and sneered. "Because Jiaodong Commandery cultivators like you, compared to us, always lack something." Zheng Jingqing's eyebrows rose. He said gravely, "What is it?" Pan Rui looked at him and said slowly, "When Jing Xiu and I first met, before she took me into Chongling, I was in a mountain town outside the Bazin Kendo ground. The army was fighting on the Bazin Kendo ground. A band of bandits fled past the village we were in, and took the chance to rob the surrounding towns. Almost all the adults in the town were killed, and only many small children were able to survive by hiding in some hidden corners. Among the children who survived, I was also one of the weakest and scrawniest. In order to fight for some food, these children turned into wolves and killed each other, but I was the one who survived in the end. Thinking about it now, it is too much of a coincidence. Her palace attendants could have appeared at any time, but why did they appear when we killed each other and I was the only one left?" Pan Rui laughed. "Many of you Jiaodong Commandery cultivators cultivate like this, but there is an essential difference between you and us. From the start of your cultivation, you knew you would encounter something like this. You had a long time to fear, to overcome your fear, and to prepare. But we are different. We suddenly encountered something like this. We encountered such a hopeless situation without any preparation. That's why you don't have the innate courage that we do. A wolf raised from a pack of dogs is not the same as a born wolf king. Zheng Jingqing frowned. But Pan Rui did not give him time to speak and continued. So you want to choose the most suitable time to destroy my presence. But the more desperate the situation is, the more it can stimulate my spirit. Even more importantly, these days I have been thinking about some of the sword moves in the sword manual. Zheng Jingqing's expression froze. Pan Rui looked at him and said seriously, I am studying some of the sword moves in the Chen Wang sword manual. Now I have mostly thought it through. So I said that this conversation with me will not eliminate some of your negative emotions, and will only make you less confident. Pan Rui looked at the silent Zheng Jingqing. Her calm eyes suddenly turned into a stormy ocean filled with murderousness. This is the chance I have been waiting for to attack. Chapter 554. Zheng Jingqing frowned deeply. He didn't like the feeling he was having right now. If he did not have absolute confidence, he would not try. Everyone only had one life. He cherished his life more than most cultivators. So when he heard Pan Rui's words, he did not hesitate to crush a seal weapon that had landed in his hand. Without a sound, the small boat he was on and the water surface beneath the small boat caved in. The caved-in came from the primal energies of the universe that suddenly appeared in this area. The primal energies of the universe released from his hand caused the air around him to become extremely heavy. In the next moment, the primal energies of the universe bloomed outwards and turned into balls of white cloud. A sea of white clouds should have floated in the sky, but now they filled this river. His body and aura instantly disappeared into the sea of clouds. Pan Rui was in the sea of clouds and could not be certain if he was advancing or retreating. The white clouds that filled her sight did not have any murderousness, but they could be everywhere. But her expression did not change at all. When these white clouds formed, her response was to send vital energy into the seal weapon she held in her left hand. When she had been talking with Zheng Jingqing, her left hand had been hidden in her sleeve, and she had been holding this seal weapon in her left hand. In reality, this was the moment she had been waiting for. Her seal weapon had been waiting to meet Zheng Jingqing's seal weapon. The seal weapon she held in her left hand was a crystal ball. More accurately, it was a sea beast core with many seal scripts carved on its surface. The seal scripts carved on the surface of this core gave off an orange light, and were as complex as flowers. The core was slightly blue and transparent, but there seemed to be countless lines of water flowing inside. When her vital energy flowed into the Niden through the seal scripts, the Niden gave a soft hum. All of its color disappeared, and it became absolutely transparent. Countless threads of primal energies of the universe gathered like flowing water burst out of her hand. The heaven-earth primordial chi passed through the white clouds. The white clouds instantly disappeared and bloomed into layers of light and shadow. Zheng Jingqing's figure reappeared in her line of sight. On the shore in front of her, the layers of light and shadows seemed to absorb the light, causing the small world she and Zheng Jingqing were in to become even brighter, causing Zheng Jingqing's figure to become even clearer in her eyes. However, Zheng Jingqing couldn't see her. Zheng Jingqing's face was as pale as when Zheng Bainiao's heart-thought sword was broken by Xin Xian. The seal weapon he used was the White Cloud Ocean Seal, unique to Jiaodong Commandery, and a seal weapon that only cultivators of his level could have. It was extremely rare. But at this time, Pan Rui had activated some kind of powerful seal weapon and drew in the primal energies of the universe from his seal weapon, forming all kinds of shadows around him. There were tall islands, seas, giant ships floating on the sea, and even cities floating in the air. This was a mirage that could occasionally be seen during sea voyages. Pan Rui's seal weapon seemed to have moved a mirage and smashed it around him. This kind of seal weapon could only be made from the cores of the legendary deep sea beast. Even Jiaodong Commandery did not have such a beast core, and did not have such a seal weapon. He could not understand why Pan Rui would have such a seal weapon. What terrified him the most was that this seal weapon was only useful when his White Cloud Ocean seal was activated. How did you know I have the White Cloud Ocean seal? How did you know I would use this seal weapon? He looked in terror at the illusory shadows around him, and shouted. A breath ago, Pan Rui could not see where he was, but now, his vision and perception were blocked by these illusory shadows, and he could not see where Pan Rui was. His shout was answered by a flash of sword light. A thin and light sword light fell from behind him like a fallen leaf, or like a spot of light falling from the bushes. A powerful aura of life was generated. A bright red lifebond sword appeared in Jing Jingqing's hand. His lifebond sword was made from a kind of blood coral found in the deep sea. This kind of blood coral grew for tens of thousands of years at the bottom of the sea. It was hard and dense, and made from the bones of countless corals and the materials in the sea. It had a unique primal energy of the universe, especially after being nourished and tempered by his lifebond energy for many years. When this lifebond sword appeared in his hand, the sword energy that poured out was like a true tide. Jing Jingqing waved his sword and easily shattered the sword light that was coming at him. But his lifebond sword could not tear apart the illusory shadows around him. Another sword light came out of the shadow of an enormous ship in front of him and attacked. Jing Jingqing swung his sword and easily destroyed this sword light. But another sword light came out from the side and attacked. He swung his sword again, but another sword light came out. The mirages covering him seemed to never disappear, and these sword lights seemed to be coming out forever. The blood on his lips faded, becoming snow white. At this time, Pan Rui's voice sounded in the surrounding illusory shadows and reached his ears. Other than what I told you before, the cultivators of Jiaodong Commandery have neglected some important matters in these years. In these years, the cultivators of Jiaodong Commandery have been too pampered, and enjoyed power and glory under Zheng Xiu's shadow. You are not like the cultivators of Chongling who face great danger at all times. Also, all the cultivators of Chongling do not like the people of Jiaodong Commandery. The more power you have, the more glory you are the public enemy of Chongling cultivators. The public enemy of Chongling cultivators? Yi Xiling? Zheng Jingqing was one of the few people from Jiaodong Commandery that even Zheng Xiu feared the most. From Pan Rui's words that struck at his confidence, he perceptively grasped some information. His heart was filled with a boundless chill, causing his hands to become somewhat cold and stiff. Ever since he, Zheng Bainiao and the others officially entered Chongling, the nobility of Chongling had all maintained their silence, especially the bureau chief of the astrology bureau, Yi Xiling. He seemed to fear their arrival, and did not have any contact with them. Yet, other than the Qin dynasty fleet that was still overseas, only Yi Xiling had killed many powerful deep-sea beasts overseas, and could have such a seal weapon made from beast cores. Previously, he had sensed Zheng Bainiao's death. Now that he was assassinating Pan Rui, he was falling into the other's trap step by step. All of this, if Jiaodong Commandery lost in Chongling this time, it would be because of the woman who seemed to fear them the most and did not care about anything. Only now did he realize and put away his disdain for Chongling. He finally understood why the old families of the past always thought of the Jiaodong Commandery as country bumpkins. However, the price he had to pay for such an awakening was a little too high. Chapter 555. Zheng Jingqing and Pan Rui's battle was far from Chongling, but not all cultivators could sense it. Because they cultivated the same vital energy method, and their cultivation was strong enough, the yellow-robed man in the carriage, walking in the drizzle of Chongling, sensed the result of Zheng Jingqing and Pan Rui's battle. He could not know the process of the two's fight, but he could sense Jing Jingqing's presence disappear in the end. Jiaodong Commandery paid attention to famous cultivators, and even the rising stars of Chongling's cultivation places, including some students who had just started to cultivate but performed well. Jiaodong Commandery had many storehouses that stored detailed information on the cultivators they paid close attention to. Jiaodong Commandery had detailed evaluations of grandmasters above Realm 7. Jiaodong Commandery's evaluation was likely the most authoritative in the world of cultivators. Many years ago, when Zheng Xiu entered Chongling, Jiaodong Commandery had evaluated the young talents of the same generation as Zheng Xiu. Later, the development of these young talents and their progress in cultivation were mostly the same as Jiaodong Commandery's evaluation. In Jiaodong Commandery's evaluation, Zheng Bainiao killing Xin Xian and Zheng Jingqing killing Pan Rui was foolproof. From any angle, Xin Xian and Pan Rui were not cultivators of the same level as Zheng Bainiao and Zheng Jingqing. Jiaodong Commandery had set Xin Xian as the first target to kill, mainly because they wanted to exchange for the silence of the Chongling nobility. This was the balance between the nobility. Xin Xian was a new power, and harmed the interests of many people in Chongling. But he was the Empress' arm. Other than Jiaodong Commandery's own people, the other Chongling nobility did not dare to move against Xin Xian. Jiaodong Commandery did not want Empress Zheng Xiu to be too strong. Killing Xin Xian had double benefits for Jiaodong Commandery and the Chongling nobility. Pan Rui was set as the second target to be killed. First, Pan Rui had once been the Empress' confidant, and knew too many secrets of Jiaodong Commandery. Also, after leaving the Empress, she had become an ownerless duckweed. Even Mo Shouqing, who was related to her, had died. Killing her would not cause any dissatisfaction. From a certain perspective, Xin Xian and Pan Rui had to die. But now, Xin Xian and Pan Rui were still alive, but Zheng Bainiao and Zheng Jingqing were dead. In the secret conversation between Chief Inspector Chen and Yi Xiling, Chief Inspector Chen had mentioned to Yi that Jiaodong Commandery had sent 3 people. But when Jiaodong Commandery officially stepped onto the stage of Chongling, they could not just send 3 people. The reason it was 3 was because the weight of these 3 people was enough to affect the structure of Chongling. Now, there was only one alone was left in Jiaodong Commandery. Pan Rui and Zheng Jingqing's battle was just a duel between cultivators. Jiaodong Commandery only had absolute confidence in Zheng Jingqing. But in order to kill Xin Xian in Chongling, Jiaodong Commandery had made countless arrangements. The people who could resolve this situation had secretly mobilized a great amount of power. Xiu Chang's not and her, SSSSS, S is a secret, she kills. Since when did Chongling have such a powerful power that Jiaodong Commandery did not know about? This was a terrifying matter in terms of strategy. But this yellow-robed man did not panic because of this. He was still thinking quietly. What he was thinking about was still killing. What he was thinking about now was who he should kill in order to completely turn the situation around. Perhaps only the people of Jiaodong Commandery and Zheng Xiu could understand his thoughts right now. He was not just the oldest and most senior cultivator of the 3, he was also the most terrifying cultivator of the 3, and even of all of Jiaodong Commandery. He had a powerful and domineering name, Zheng Husha. Jiaodong Commandery was near the sea, and lived off the sea. In the sea, the vicious tiger sharks were the overlords, and the synonym for killing. Who to kill, that was the problem. The carriage was still slowly moving through Chongling's drizzle. Zheng Husha was quietly and seriously considering this problem. However, in his incomparably sharp world of perception, there was a trace of noise. For a cultivator like him, even if he was completely focused on thinking about important matters, he could still clearly sense any minute changes within a radius of several hundred zhang around him. He could sense the shape of any drop of water that splashed onto the ground, the movements of any insect. He could even sense the roots in the earth, how they absorbed rainwater, as well as how the water flowed through the root. When the noise sounded, he had already seen the source of the noise. It was a swordsman leaning against the window of a tea house hundreds of feet away. A thin, handleless flying sword fell from that swordsman's sleeve into the gutter below the window. Then, this sword was like a fast-swimming fish, quickly moving through the water, the sword intent aimed directly at the carriage he was in. Jing Husha frowned. He was not interested in the sneak attack of a swordsman of this cultivation. He reached out a hand in the dim cabin of the carriage and made a simple motion, like he was clenching his fist. A whirlpool suddenly appeared in the air in front of the swordsman hundreds of feet away. Rainwater spun in this whirlpool, causing this whirlpool to become unusually clear. The moment the swordsman controlling the flying sword saw this whirlpool, he felt the power of the whirlpool enter his heart meridian. He didn't even have time to change his expression before his heart meridian was twisted into a ball by a powerful force. He hung his head weakly and died. Blood sprayed out of his mouth, flowing down the walls of the tea house and into the gutter below. The flying sword was dozens of feet away from the carriage. Having lost its support, it floated in the water like a leaf for a while and then silently sank into the mud of the gutter. An assassin's assassination attempt had not even been completed when he was killed by him. However, Jing Husha was not in the least bit pleased with himself. He slowly pulled back his hand and looked up. He had been thinking about killing people, but now someone wanted to kill him. This seemed laughable, but it was not laughable. Several cries of alarm rang out, and the carriage that had been moving at a moderate pace suddenly came to a halt. On the path in front of the carriage stood a man in cloth robes like an iron tower. His hands were hugging a black iron pillar the size of several people. With a thunderous roar, he directly threw this black iron pillar towards the carriage. Chapter 556. Jing Husha's expression was indifferent. In this moment, he was certain that he needed to kill many people, and not just one. This iron tower-like man's throw almost used up all the vital essence and primal energies of the universe in his body. Adding on his natural strength, he was an anomaly among cultivators. On the battlefield, he was definitely able to break through formations, and could even instantly kill several swordsmen who were using flying sword. A cultivator like this was a valuable asset to the army. Even if the marquisate establishments used cultivators like this, and had him die in the streets of Chongling, they could not bear the anger of the imperial palace. The swordsman from before, and this man in cloth robes who was officially blocking the way, made him certain that a terrifying killing trap had formed around him. Just like how he could not guess who the new power in Chongling was, he could not guess who dared to set up such a trap to kill him. But he made his choice in this moment. After Jing Bainiao and Jing Jingqing died, Jiaodong Commandery could not have a gentle ending when they entered Chongling. There was no room to maneuver. For him, if he fled Chongling, it meant that Jiaodong Commandery could never replace Jing Xiu's position in Chongling. So he decided to gamble his last chip. He wanted to see if he would be killed, or kill until the person who set up this trap was terrified, and the other could not bear the consequences of such a loss. Who is it? When this man in cloth robes publicly attacked on the street, Jing Husha was not the only person who was certain that a new power had appeared in Chongling. The most shocked was Chief Inspector Chen of the Divinity Bureau. The duty of the Divinity Bureau was to inspect the cultivators in Chongling. If a new power was born, he should be the first to detect it. Yet even he did not know who had broken Jiaodong Commandery's trap to kill Shen Xian. And now, he did not know where these cultivators who were publicly trying to assassinate Jing Husha came from. The enormous iron pillar flew through the air, causing many people to feel cold. When the shadow of the front end of this enormous black metal pillar covered the front of the carriage, the wild wind that it carried caused the entire carriage to creak. Just as it felt as though it was about to fall apart, the cold-faced Jinghusha once again extended his left hand. His left hand gently reached out and pressed forward. It did not seem to carry any great power, but the front end of the black iron pillar suddenly sank and smashed into the bricks of the street. The terrifying impact caused large pieces of the ground to be lifted up like fragile pieces of paper. However, Zheng Husha's control over his strength had already reached the pinnacle. The ground he had lifted up stopped a foot away from the front of the car and began to crack, spewing out dust and debris. Zheng Husha's hand did not fall. Instead, he flicked his finger gently. An expanse of debris passed through the dust, accelerating at a crazy speed. It began to burn, bringing with it a dazzling light that was as bright as the most dazzling diamond. There was a muffled sound. The dazzling fragments left behind long strands of light in the air, instantly piercing through the iron tower-like linen-clothed man's forehead. In the next moment, the man's head violently exploded. The fragments turned into extremely hot smoke and dust, burning the flesh and blood to ashes. This linen-clothed man turned into a headless corpse that stood on the street. His vital energy had been used up in just now's attack. He had no power to fight. Zheng Husha did not need to waste vital energy to kill an enemy like him. Yet this was not willfulness. This was attitude. This was a demonstration. But at this moment an arrow came from the west. An arrow, not a sword. An arrow light came from the west. It did not fall towards him in the carriage, but the carriage driver at the front of the carriage. A howl came from the front of the carriage. A sword light lit up. Lifebond presence surged from the carriage driver's hand. A bloody red sword light cut towards the arrow light. Even if it was just a carriage driver, he was already a worthy swordsman. In Chongling, there were not many people under Realm 7 who could withstand this blow. However, the scarlet sword light was unable to hit the arrow light at all. The sword light passed through the remaining shadows at the tail of the arrow. Under this coachman's horrified gaze, his body exploded outwards. There was a loud explosion. The carriage tilted forward. The carriage driver and the front of the carriage all disappeared. The fingers on Zheng Husha's left hand trembled slightly. His left eyelid also twitched slightly. In that instant, he had already sensed the power of this arrow and wanted to block it. He was certain that the other's arrow was just a demonstration. Yet, he still did not have the time. But the ripple in his mind only existed for a moment. He let the energy in his left hand vibrate and release outward. The carriage easily tore apart like paper, twisted like water, and then turned to dust that spread outwards. The carriage also disappeared. He stood in the street. Then he looked up. The sunlight in the sky dimmed for a moment. Because there was an arrow light that was blinding and even covered the light of the sun. This arrow light was falling towards him. Zheng Husha narrowed his eyes at this arrow light. Suddenly, a cold smile bloomed on his face. He reached out with his left hand with an indescribable strength and grasped at the arrow light. The arrow light was facing his palm. A majestic power gushed out from his palm. An ear-piercing shriek was emitted from the surroundings of the arrow light. This was the sound of ghosts wailing and wolves howling. Yet, this arrow light had been much faster than the sound before. Now that the sound came with the arrow light, it meant that the arrow light had slowed down. When it was still a few feet away from his palm, the arrow light suddenly stopped. It was as if a spark had crashed into an extremely thick ice wall. The arrow light was like tens of thousands of golden threads that bloomed outwards and revealed the arrow itself. This was a deep blue arrow made of essence gold. Even the tail feathers were no exception. Visible ripples exploded at the tip of the arrow, but it could not advance any further. In the next moment, the force from the back of the arrow continuously collided with the tip of the arrow. This fine gold arrow shattered bit by bit. Under the pressure of the powerful yuan qi that surged out from Zheng Hushe's palm, it floated like dust. Then, as his 5 fingers contracted, it was squeezed into a ball, turning into a round ball. Zheng Hushe held this essence gold ball. At this time, the light from the arrow was still blooming outwards. It was as if he had caught a real star. This presence was like that of a true god. But his expression was strange. He looked at the round ball and said softly to himself, "There are Chu people here?" Chapter 557. At this time, the star-like scene in his hand was extremely powerful. The 3 people from Jiaodong Commandery were all extraordinary realm 7 grandmasters. They were existences that Empress Zheng Xiu and the 2 ministers were wary of. From a certain point of view, even if they did things within certain rules, they were as intimidating as the cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace and Bai Shanshui in the past. In terms of cultivation, these 3 people represented the strongest power of Jiaodong Commandery, and surpassed by Shanshui and Zhao Si before the Deer Mountain Conference. Zheng Hushe was also the strongest of the 3. Even though Zheng Bainiao thought he was invincible in his realm, he did not include Zheng Hushe among them. In Zheng Bainiao's view, Zheng Hushe was not a cultivator of the same realm as him, even if Zheng Hushe had not completely broken through and reached Realm 8. Some people cultivated different methods and had different talent. This caused the power of their vital energy and the amount of vital energy stored in their bodies to be different from ordinary cultivators. Back then, Wang Jingmeng had been one of them, and now, Zheng Hushe was one of them. Facing just now's arrow with his cultivation, he could choose a simpler response that would consume less vital energy and would not harm him. He needed to establish his dominance. He needed all of Chongling, especially the cultivators who had come on orders to kill him, to see his strength in these few short breaths. He did not want those cultivators who were much weaker than him to join the battle. After all, if there were enough ants, they could eat beetles many times larger. So, he had to use the most arrogant and domineering method to have those cultivators who were not loyalists withdraw from this battle. But this was not the best result he wanted to see. The best result he wanted to see was that the great power in the shadows would see the power he displayed and give up on the idea of killing him. But such a powerful archer came from the Chu. The power involved far surpassed his imagination. The light on the golden ball in his hand quickly disappeared. At the end of his sight, clear footsteps sounded in the street shrouded in rain. The footsteps were crisp and clear, and one could clearly hear that there was only one person slowly walking over, but it made all the houses in this street tremble. Zheng Hushe's lips parted slightly. His brows furrowed deeply. The tremors from the ground continued to spread into his body through his feet. Every tiny piece of flesh in his body was trembling, causing his heart to feel slightly uncomfortable. He needed to breathe slowly to dissolve the substantial pressure from his opponent. At this moment, the sky darkened again. The archer that he was afraid of shot another arrow. This time, the arrow had a terrifying penetrating power. The arrow tip and shaft had a unique structure. The arrow tip spun freely at high speed, but the shaft was extremely stable. Moreover, as it flew rapidly, the runes on the arrow constantly gathered the energy of the world. Every time it traveled a certain distance in the air, it would cause an explosion of energy. Every time it exploded, the arrow would disappear in the air, and then suddenly reappear. Zheng Hushe took a deep breath. His left hand made a simple throwing motion, and the metal ball he was holding exploded in front of him with a spiral of air, and then disappeared in an instant. His previous demonstration was not just for the person who set up the trap, but also a clear message to the archer. Since I am a swordsman, without using my life-bond sword, I can hold your arrow with my hand. Then I naturally have the ability to kill you regardless of distance. On a roof far away from him, a tall and thin archer in indigo robes held a deep blue bow. The bowstring was vibrating at a high frequency. Zheng Hushe's throwing motion with his left hand had just finished when the golden ball appeared in front of him with a boom. In this moment, the golden ball seemed to be frozen in the air, but the energy around it gave off a golden color like an enormous sunflower blooming. The air facing the azure-robed archer was forced to form a transparent energy sword by the power released by the metal ball. The tip of the sword stabbed towards his chest with great precision. The indigo-robed archer looked at the energy sword stabbing towards his chest. His pupils contracted, but his expression did not change. His tall and thin body appeared soft in this moment, like a willow branch bending in the wind. With a loud bang, the dark blue longbow in his hand flew out of his hand. A wave of power that he couldn't resist landed on his body, causing his body to fly backward. He smashed through the roof and fell into a pile of broken tiles. The indigo-robed archer's body bounced like a bowstring. He started to cough blood, but he was still alive. It was also at this moment that the clear sound of footsteps in front of Zheng Hushe suddenly disappeared. A figure seemed to have directly jumped down from the sky. The strong wind around him directly formed a huge hole in the sky, sweeping the rain in the streets and alleys far away. The previous arrow light had caused the already dim light in the rain to become even dimmer. But the arrival of this person caused the sky to lose its cover and quickly brighten. Zheng Hushe raised his head high. He quickly saw the figure of this cultivator who had come from the distance and seemed to have jumped down from the sky. "Fourth uncle?" His breathing suddenly stopped, but two words were squeezed out from between his lips and teeth, and the sound of metal rubbing against metal rang out. This was an old man. His face was covered in wrinkles, and even had the black spots that represented the aging of cultivators. But the sword essence coming from this old man was so strong it was like a heavenly punishment. So it is one of us, after all this it is still an internal conflict. A self-mocking smile appeared at the corners of Zheng Hushe's mouth. His right hand rose and grabbed at the air. There was a loud bang. The sky turned golden. A golden dragon horn appeared above Zheng Hushe. The golden light surged upwards like a waterfall. The old man who had jumped down from the sky was immediately sent flying, and turned into a small shadow in the air. "Dragon Horn Sword, you really are the strongest cultivator of Jiaodong Commandery." In the quiet imperial palace, Zheng Xiu raised her head to look at the golden light. With true admiration, she murmured in a cold voice. When her voice sounded, in the sky where even the cultivators of Jiaodong Commandery could not sense, a pale star flashed, and a thin line of fire fell down. A thin wave of primal energies of the universe formed, and seeped into the mud of this alley. There was a flying sword lying quietly in the mud of this alley. This hiltless flying sword came from the beginning of this killing situation, the nameless swordsman who had been killed by Zheng Hushe at the start. This flying sword sunk in the mud was very close to Zheng Hushe at this time. When Zheng Hushe swung the golden dragon horn, and sent the old man falling from the sky flying, this thin sword flew up with unimaginable speed, and landed on Zheng Hushe's back, and then came out of his chest. There was a hiss. A wave of energy and bloody mist sprayed out of Zheng Hushe's chest. Zheng Hushe reacted instinctively. The golden dragon horn fell, and with a ding, the thin sword was cut into many pieces. But at the same time, Zheng Hushe smiled bitterly, and his head drooped. Chapter 558. Zheng Hushe bowed his head. His legs could not support his own weight, and he slowly knelt on the ground. That thin sword had passed through his heart. No matter what cultivation a cultivator was, they should have died by now. But Zheng Hushe had not died yet. When the street was completely silent, when all the primal energies of the universe disappeared, and the sound of rain ruled this place, he had not died. This battle had alarmed many people, but when the battle ended, no one dared to walk into this alley. The rain washed away the blood. The blood on the headless corpse in front of him was completely washed away, and the flesh turned pale white. Finally, footsteps could be heard in the deathly silent alley. A yellow paper umbrella circled around the headless corpse and floated over. The one holding the umbrella was a yellow-robed boy. This boy held the umbrella and helped an old man block the rain. This old man was the cultivator who had jumped down from the sky but had been sent flying by Jing Hush's sword. At this time, he did not have the presence he had just now. He was slightly dispirited, and coughed softly with a handkerchief covering his mouth. As he coughed, bloody foam seeped out of his mouth like a tuberculosis patient. Hanging on by one breath, is it hard? The old man walked to a position where Jing Husha could see his toes. With a hint of true emotion, he said softly, "Don't worry about it. It is hard." Jing Husha could not raise his head. He looked at the old man's toes and said bitterly, "But fourth uncle, if some things are not said clearly, I will not die in peace." The old man was silent for a long time and said, "There are many people in Chongling who die in peace. You are not one of them. You should know that I am here to talk to you because I know you held back when you attacked me. But other than this, we are still family. You are the person in charge of the family, and someone I followed for a long time when I was young." The light in Jing Husha's eyes dimmed. Jing Xiu's plan was ingenious. She only wasted the lives of 2 cultivators. But in the end, you were able to form such a killing trap because of the timing you used to draw my sword and your control over the sword you stabbed me with. If it wasn't for the fact that the one who attacked me was you, my mind wouldn't have been so shaken. If it wasn't for the fact that I couldn't sense her sword in time, I wouldn't have been half a beat slower. The brows of the yellow-robed old man trembled slightly. He lowered his head and said, "What you said is the truth. I admit that I used a trick. It's not very honorable." Jing Husha did not pay attention to his words and continued, "Jing Xiu is able to use such a sword move. She must have finally obtained the heaven-replenishing divine art, but fourth uncle, you should know that no matter what, I have never thought of killing her." The yellow-robed old man fell silent for a short while before he said, "You're too strong. If you don't die, then many things won't succeed if you don't agree to it." Jing Husha didn't argue. He just said softly with difficulty, "But I'm dead. Jing Bainyao and Jing Jingqing are also dead. Is this the result you want to see? The powerful Jiaodong commandery has become weak." The yellow-robed old man shook his head. This time, he did not hesitate. His expression was firm and certain. Jiaodong commandery has not become weak, but stronger. He looked at Jing Husha and said, "In order for Jing Xiu and Jiaodong commandery to truly become one, there are 2 choices. One is your choice and the other is our choice. All of Jiaodong commandery's power will become one with her will. Even more importantly, we have different views from you. We think that she will be stronger than you." After a pause, he said, "In the future, there will be no Jing Xiu and Jiaodong commandery, only Jing Xiu. Such a group of madmen." Jing Husha laughed. "She is mad, you are mad. If you all die in the end, and she is the only one to enjoy the fruits of others' labor, do you not care?" The yellow-robed old man nodded and said seriously, "People who want to achieve great things all have some madness. From a certain point of view, while Jiaodong commandery has lost many powerful cultivators this time, all of our power has returned to one point. There are no other opinions. This is the strongest time in the history of Jiaodong commandery." He looked at Jing Husha, who was laughing until blood came out of his nose and mouth. He nodded in greeting. "You are finally dead. Dying at my hands, dying at the hands of the people you taught. You should not be angry but proud." In the cold imperial palace, Empress Jing Xiu, who had been standing behind the spirit spring, looked at the street where Jing Husha's life had ended, and slowly said to herself. Her face was still cold, but her eyes rippled with the color of a human. This color was filled with true joy. Ever since she started to cultivate, there had been countless shadows over her head. These shadows planned her life, and were above her will. These people who created the shadows destroyed things they did not want to see. When she entered Chongling and became the empress, these shadows lessened. But Jing Husha, who was stronger than her in cultivation and battle power, and had great authority in Jiaodong commandery, was still the biggest shadow over her head. Now, even the last and largest shadow had finally dissipated. Starting today, she was Jiaodong commandery, and Jiaodong commandery was her. Her will was Jiaodong commandery's will. Wang Jinwei stood at the highest point of the turret and watched Jing Husha's death from a distance. Following him through the entire process were the cold-faced guards on the turret. Other than the new powerhouse who had stopped Jing Bainyao from killing Xin Xian, there was no fourth new powerhouse in Chongling. Jing Husha's death was just a family change. Such a powerful cultivator was killed on the street at such a small price. Everyone who saw and knew of this family change would not feel that Jiaodong commandery's power had weakened greatly, and would only feel the strength of the mistress of Chongling again. This was her demonstration, reminding everyone again how cold and powerful she was. Wang Jinwei knew that she had suffered many blows in the past winter, but no one had seen her move or counterattack. Some people would think that other than useless madness, she had no ability to fight back. But her counterattack had already started. First, settle down. Before the spring expedition started, she had completely taken control of Jiaodong commandery. Wang Jinwei maintained his silence, but his breathing was unconsciously disordered. He seemed to sense an enormous beast breaking free of its cage. Chapter 559. Spring was coming. When the Qin dynasty stopped concealing the frequent movements of the army, in reality, the war between the Qin dynasty and the Chu dynasty had already started. If Zhao Mu does not lead, it will be difficult to convince the masses. In the depths of the Chu palace, consort Zhao Xiang looked calmly at Lin Zhujiu, who was sitting in front of her. She said, I know that the rear is more important than the front lines, but he is the most suitable commander to lead the army. The ownership of millions of soldiers, the power of the country, cannot be given to other people, much less for you to lead. Lin Zhujiu did not look like he had in the water prison. He was dressed in indigo robes and appeared unspeakably clean and refreshed. Of course we will not lead. He looked at consort Zhao and smiled slightly. He said, because the one leading will be you. Consort Zhao stilled and frowned slightly. I will lead, and Zhao Mu will stabilize the rear. But before the Gold Flame Dagger army returns, according to your plan, there will be many defeats. The morale of the army will not be stable, and more chaos will occur. Lin Zhujiu said, regardless of the process, as long as you lead the decisive battle and win, you will have the highest authority. Consort Zhao thought. Since this is the case, then it is better to be more thorough. Lin Zhujiu looked curiously at her. I do not understand what you mean by more thorough, Consort Zhao said. If some battles have a high chance of failure, then have those people who have always opposed me appear in those battles. Lin Zhujiu stilled and sighed. I cannot deny that women are more decisive than men when they do things. Not letting me lead the army, and stay in the rear to help her kill, why? In a tent in a military camp of the Chu dynasty, a general dressed in black armor sneered. Even if I agree, even if I am reassured, will other people be reassured? This general with a cold face, a slender figure, and a beautiful pair of narrow eyebrows was Zhao Mu, who was publicly acknowledged to be the best at war, especially leading the army. His surname was Zhao, but he was born and raised in Yuanyang commandery of the Chu dynasty. He had nothing to do with Consort Zhao in terms of birth. In the past many years, he had been the source of confidence for many top generals of the Chu dynasty. From a certain point of view, Consort Zhao Xiang's orders needed his approval. Now, it was clear that he did not agree. However, just as he sneered at his trusted subordinates, he sensed a familiar presence approaching. He put away his smile in shock and stood up. Then, he bowed deeply towards the person who opened the curtain and said, "Teacher." This was an extremely old man whose hair was as white as snow. Seeing the appearance of this old man, the several high-ranking military officers in the tent were so shocked that they were speechless. The reason Zhao Mu entered the upper echelons of the military so quickly was because he was the favorite disciple of the former god of war of the Chu army, Li Fu. This old man was Li Fu, who had been in seclusion for many years. What shocked these people even more was that this old man was not wearing his usual casual clothes, but heavy battle armor. If teacher is the one leading the troops, this disciple will naturally be convinced. I won't be the one leading the troops at the front line. I'll stay behind with you to help her kill people. Why? Hearing the unexpected answer, Zhao Mu suddenly looked up in puzzlement at his teacher. Li Fu looked at him and grinned. He was as rough as when he had been in charge of the army. What why? Zhao Mu hesitated slightly and then straightened. This disciple is not reassured. This is not the outcome of the battlefield. The people of the Bazin Kendo ground are the best at fighting in the world. He did not wait for Li Fu's response. He looked into Li Fu's eyes and said, "But who does the Chu belong to now?" Li Fu looked at his favorite disciple and slowly put away his smile. He scolded simply, "Idiot!" Zhao Mu stilled. The generals in the tent were also stunned. Even you know her relationship with the Bazin Kendo ground. You know that she is, in a sense, a member of the Bazin Kendo ground. Did the previous emperor not know? Li Fu looked at Zhao Mu like he was an idiot. His voice was cold. You still do not understand. The previous emperor gave the throne to Li Lingjun, not because he trusted Li Lingjun, but Consort Zhao? Zhao Mu's entire body trembled. For a moment, he was speechless. Since the previous emperor was reassured to give the Chu to her, what are you worried about? Li Fu sneered and said, "No woman can bewitch the previous emperor. Only true love can make the previous emperor feel reassured." The previous emperor loved her, and she loved the previous emperor. Only the most sincere feelings in the world can make the previous emperor put her in that position. It's not her background, her cultivation, or her strength. Li Fu narrowed his eyes and looked at Zhao Mu. He said slowly, "She will not give less than you for the previous emperor and this dynasty, so you can rest assured. Only women are forced into prostitution. I have never heard of people being forced to lead troops into war. I only know how to admire fish and flowers, wander the streets and willow alleys. Idleness is my greatest skill. I want to see Consort Zhao. Demon Consort Zhao, you dare to treat me like this?" In a large courtyard surrounded by a large number of soldiers, there were continuous roars, which gradually turned into shrill screams. A fat middle-aged man in brocade robes was surrounded by a dozen flying swords. His white face was covered in slaps, his mouth full of blood as he screamed. "Stop screaming!" A light voice sounded outside the hall. The fat middle-aged man's screams suddenly stopped. His eyes widened as he looked in surprise at Zhao Mo. "Zhao Mo, it's good that you came. Help me, I will not help you." Zhao Mo shook his head and interrupted him. "You are not the only one who will go to the border. Many people in the capital will go to the border like you." "What do you mean?" The fat middle-aged man was stunned. When he reacted, he was furious and shouted, "Zhao Mo, you are kneeling under Demon Consort Zhao's skirt." Zhao Mo turned and ignored him. The fat middle-aged man was even angrier. He cursed, "Zhao Mo, Your mother is a servant girl. Demon Consort's mother is a prostitute. No wonder you are in cahoot. Kill him, Zhao Mo said. When he said these two words, a high-ranking military officer at his side turned around. With a hiss, a red line appeared on the fat middle-aged man's neck. The chubby middle-aged man's voice stopped. He raised his hand to touch his neck, but he had lost all his strength and couldn't touch it at all. How is this possible? How dare you kill me? The fat middle-aged man stared at Zhao Mo's back with wide eyes. With a gurgling sound, his head fell to the ground. At the beginning, the harsher the methods, the more people will be convinced. Unfortunately, as the target of killing the chicken to warn the monkey, you do not know it. Zhao Mo did not turn to look. He only said softly to the general beside him, "If anyone makes a move, kill them." Chapter 560. In the twilight, dim yellow light came from the slightly open doors of the Chu imperial palace's throne room like the slightly open mouth of a monster. A palace attendant with a slender waist walked out. She had a gentle and respectful expression as she invited an official standing outside the door into the hall. The Chu's weapons were the best in the world, beautiful, and so were the buildings of the imperial palace. This throne room did not appear vast from the outside, just exquisite and beautiful. But the inside was spacious, and the dragon throne at the end looked exceptionally far away. On the dragon throne, Li Lingjun propped up his chin with his hand. He seemed to be deep in thought, but also seemed to be in a bad mood. He did not open his eyes to look at this official. This official was one of the retainers that had followed him from Chongling to Deer Mountain, and then to the Chu capital. After Li Lingjun officially became the Chu emperor, this retainer was given the title of Qingzong. In the court of the Chu dynasty, this was just an official responsible for checking the books. While his rank was not low, it was actually an idle position that could allow him to retire. An official like this, at a time like this, would not have any matters to discuss with the emperor. The slender palace attendant left the hall. Other than the monarch and subject, there was no one else in this spacious hall. There was no wind at all. The hanging bead curtains were moved by a certain presence and gave off crisp sounds. Li Lingjuan's hand separated from his chin. He slowly looked up at this seemingly weak official and said expressionlessly, "Jing Xiu's intentions can reach here so quickly?" This official maintained a respectful appearance and did not respond. Li Lingjuan's expression did not change. After an unknown amount of time, he looked at this official and said, "What does she want to say to me?" This official looked up calmly and said, "She wants me to say something to you. She will give you another chance." Seeing him so calm, Li Lingjun immediately thought of a certain person. He felt a wave of irritation surge out of his chest. But when he heard this official's words, his breathing suddenly stopped. He had guessed many things that Jing Xiu would say to him, but he had not expected this official to say something like this. "What do you mean?" After a moment of silence, he said coldly, "You want me to change, or you'll kill me?" The official shook his head and said, "The meaning of giving you another chance is the literal meaning. After this, you will be given another chance." Li Lingjun didn't say anything else, but his hands on the dragon throne began to tremble slightly. Mt. Dadong. This was a famous mountain in the middle of Chu. The scenery was beautiful and gentle, and there were peach gardens everywhere at the foot of the mountain. Big Cave Mountain was not a mountain with a big cave. In the central Chu region, the so-called Big Cave was a large pool of water, a large pond that was not too deep. In the other dynasties, a pond with tens of thousands of hectares of water, even if the water was not deep, was called a lake. At the southern foot of the Big Cave Mountain, among the peach gardens, there was a bamboo forest. In the depths of the bamboo forest, there was a fence. Other than a few thatched cottages, there were ginkgo trees and loquats everywhere. A soldier was standing respectfully in the yard. There were 4 or 5 people in front of him, and there were several more in the back of the courtyard. They were all men, and they stood tall and straight. Their every move seemed to have been predetermined by a ruler, and they were extremely disciplined. Most importantly, they had an iron-blooded and tough aura that could not be concealed. They were obviously cultivators in the army. This soldier handed a letter to a middle-aged man sitting on a bamboo chair. Then he did not linger and left. The middle-aged man used 2 fingers to open the letter. After just a glance at the contents of the letter, he smiled without denying it. "Great General, Li Mu himself did not go, but recommended you. This time, he sent someone to deliver a letter. I do not know what his intentions are." Seeing this middle-aged man's expression, a black-clothed man beside him who had always had a straight face couldn't help but say this in a cold voice. "Look at what he wrote." The middle-aged man called the great general aside and shook his head. He flicked his hand, and the letter in his hand flew into the air. There were only 4 words on it: "Go down in history." Go down in history? The black-robed man stilled and then frowned. He said with an unfriendly expression, "What does he mean?" The middle-aged man exhaled, and stood up with his hands clasped behind his back. The moment he stood up, his body seemed to have suddenly become incomparably tall. The aura he exuded made it seem like he was commanding soldiers on the battlefield, and in front of him stood a densely packed army whose end could not be seen. He did not look at his subordinates behind him and slowly said, "The world knows that I, Tang Mei, do not get along with Li Mu, causing me to live in seclusion. But you should know that I do not get along with him. But 2 tigers cannot live on one mountain. I am not willing to listen to his orders." Even more importantly, in the Battle of Zhou Mountain Pass, he sacrificed an allied army. While he won that battle in the end, that allied army had many of my beloved generals and brothers who fought with you. So you have much hatred towards him. But I admire the result of that battle. I do not get along with him, but in terms of understanding of personality and character, I fear that no one in the Chu dynasty can compare to him. Since Li Mu listened to Consort Zhao's arrangements and stayed in Ying, this means that he has great confidence in Consort Zhao's arrangements and the result of this battle. In his view, I am the strongest general, the best commander other than him. After a pause, the middle-aged man smiled emotionally. Since he thinks he can win, and he recommends me to replace him as commander, do you still not understand the meaning of these words? This middle-aged man did not wait for the subordinates behind him whose expressions had changed to reply. He slowly raised his head and said, "A victory like this will definitely go down in history. He is giving this chance to go down in history to me. As to personal grievances, they are nothing in front of this national enmity. Even if I die, I will not quit." The subordinates behind him shook at the same time. They took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "Even if I die, I will not quit." When such a voice rang out, the people working in the backyard all stood up in unison. "The blades are rusty, I fear they need to be sharpened," one person complained. "I fear there is not enough time," a scholarly person who was picking wild leeks said seriously. In Chongling, when the first winter jasmine bloomed, while there was no clear decree that said betrayal and disregard of the Deer Mountain Conference, all of Chongling, the world, and even the ordinary people on the streets knew that the Qin dynasty had started to attack the Chu. Even the ordinary people knew that the Qin dynasty had gathered more than 600,000 troops in the Yin Mountain area where the Chu and Qin met. The number of troops in the Wu Mountain and Yangshan Commandery was even greater. At the same time, the Chu dynasty's army far exceeded 1,000,000 on this long border. In the view of the ordinary people, while this battle was rushed, the number of troops that both sides had put in likely surpassed any battle in the history of the Qin dynasty. Even in the most difficult battle to defeat the Zhao, the Qin dynasty had used 500,000 troops to defeat the Zhao's 400,000. It was far from this scale. The Chu dynasty had profited in the small battles against the Qin dynasty. Now, the Qin dynasty's power was far greater than in the past. The Chu dynasty's strength had not weakened due to the change of emperors, and far surpassed the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties of the past. The Qin dynasty was led by Sima Qiu, one of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. Lian Bo, Fang Qilin, and Wei Wujiu were assistants. They had gathered 4 marquises in total. Each marquis of the Qin dynasty was not just a symbol of military merit, but represented a powerful army, many cultivators, death warriors, and retainers who worked together seamlessly. Of the 4, Sima Qiu had started as a strategist, and was the best strategist of the Qin dynasty other than Lin Zhujiu. At this time, he and Lian Bo were in the prime of their lives, while Fang Qilin and Wei Wujiu were 2 old generals. The combination of 2 youths and 2 old generals. Fang Qilin was old but steady. Wei Wujiu was famed for being cunning and crafty. He was famed for his ability to attack from many places, and was most suited to a battle with a large army like this. This kind of lineup would be astounding and perfect in the eyes of anyone. Yet to everyone's puzzlement, the final commander of the Chu dynasty was the General Tang Mei, who had retired many years ago. Before Tang Mei had retired, he had not been one of the highest-ranking generals of the Chu dynasty. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.